As a kid, one of my favorite TV shows of all time was Pokemon, those cute little cuddly furry animals that everyone knows and loves. Well, today I decided to build a brand new Next.js 14 app called the Pokemon Profiler. And this app is very, very intuitive in the sense that we're able to look up Pokemon data by name, as well as this app returns the very top 10 Pokemon based on abilities. And essentially it's just grabbing random Pokemon and displaying them, their images, their attributes, types, and so on. So as you can see here, if I come here to this app and if I wanted to search for a specific Pokemon, let's say Pikachu, everyone's favorite Pokemon, it's going to return Pikachu with the image as well as the type being electric, as well as the height, weight, and the abilities of Pikachu. So this is what I'm going to show you guys how to build this today. We're going to be using a free API called PokeAPI to get this up and running. You don't even need an API key for it, which is pretty sleek. So with that being said, Pikachu, I choose you. All right, so before we delve into the actual programming, I just want to explain a few things here on the screen. So as I mentioned before, we're going to be using Next.js 14, which is, as of the time of this video, the very newest version of Next.js. And now there isn't really a big difference between Next.js 13 and 14, at least in a programmatic sense. But so anything that's going to work here in Next.js 14 will also work in Next.js 13. So just keep that in mind. So at the very top of this, we have our header. And we just have the Pokemon logo, which definitely we do not own the copyrights of this logo or any of the likeness of Pokemon. This Pokemon Profiler has several different components. As I said, we have the header here, which displays the logo and just the word Profiler, which is part of this header. Then we have our search form that we're displaying, where we're going to send a query to the API, the query being the name of the Pokemon that we'd like to fetch from the API. And once we click go, it's going to fetch that data and then output it here below in this pane. So where we see Pikachu here, we have the image, we have the title, or the name rather, which is Pikachu, and the attributes of Pikachu. Now below, what we have here is a table. Now this table actually loads at the time that the page loads versus this up here, this section where Pikachu is, this loads after an event occurs. So this is where we get a bit into server-side components, or server components for short, versus client components in Next.js. We have a client component that renders Pikachu's data here because this is going to be based on the form submission event in Next.js, whereas this table below is based on the server-side rendering or the server component rendering out as the page loads. Now, there may be differences, or rather there may be some preferences, for lack of a better term, of when you would use a server component versus a client component. In a nutshell, you would use a server component like this table if you want to render data as soon as the page loads. Now, this is essentially helpful in the case of SEO. When you're trying to rank your pages online, you might want to render out a component as a server-side component, or using server-side rendering. So that way the data shows immediately upon loading the page, and that can then thereby be indexed by Google, hopefully toward the top of Google. Whereas this client component gets rendered based on the event that gets triggered based on the button click or the form submission here. So I'm going to show you guys how to build both a client component and a server component in Next.js. So without further ado, let's get to the coding. Now guys, if you haven't seen my other videos, essentially my approach to teaching folks various frameworks and languages is just to kind of do a walkthrough of the programming language or framework that we're working with. And for sure, we will be making mistakes along the way, as that's part of the learning process. So just follow along as best as you can. If you get stuck on something, pause the video, maybe go back and review a certain point that I'm covering, and feel free to drop some comments down below if you have any further questions about any topic or any specific task that we're working on. So as you can see right now, I have a prompt open, essentially is my command line or terminal. I am on a Mac. Anything that I do should also work on a Windows, but if you're not really sure how to do something, maybe just Google it. So the very first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a brand new folder that we can put our Next.js 14 project in. So first I'm going to navigate to my development projects using CD. This is my folder called development projects. And then I'm going to create a new directory by using the mkdir command. and I'm going to call this next.js-14-crash and hit enter. And then next, I'm going to change directory or CD into this new directory, next.js-14 crash. And now finally, I'm going to open up my Visual Studio Code. Now, for this course, I'm going to be using Visual Studio Code as my code editor. If you're not sure what that is, just maybe Google it, Visual Studio Code for Windows or for Mac, whatever machine you're using, and install it if you don't have it installed already. Make sure you install all the associated plugins with the program as well. You can use any other code editor. I just find that Visual Studio Code is the best one to use when working with Next.js and other frameworks. So next I'm going to type in this command, code space dot, and hit enter. And what that's going to do is open up Visual Studio Code directly in the new folder that I've created. So now let me just open this up here, and I'm just going to close this tab. So here we have the folder that I just created. So now what we are going to do is we're going to create a brand new Next.js project. So to do that, I'm going to come up top and I'm going to click on Terminal. Again, I'm on a Mac. On a Windows, it may be something different. So I'm going to click Terminal and I'm going to select New Terminal. And that's going to open up an integrated command line or an integrated terminal within my IDE. Now, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to run a command to create a Next.js project. Before we do this, you'll also need to install Node.js. So if Node.js is not installed, make sure you do that right now. I'll have all the links to everything you guys will need to install in the description of this video. So don't worry about that. But if you want to kind of jump the gun and go ahead, make sure you have the latest version of Node.js installed. I think, let me just do a double check. I think my current version is version 21.1. That's what I have as of the time of this video. So just make sure you have that installed, guys. So the very first command we're going to run here, let me just clear this out, is going to be called npx space create dash next dash app at symbol, and we're going to do this at latest. So just type out latest space dot. Now what this command does, it creates a brand new Next.js 14 project within your current directory. That's what the dot symbolizes. So when I hit enter here, and this may take a couple of moments, it's going to ask me if I would like to add certain plugins. So for this tutorial, we're going to be working with JavaScript, not TypeScript. We're going to keep things nice and simple. So I'm just going to select no for that. Would you like, essentially we're going to select all the defaults, but I'll go through these one by one so you guys can see. So it's asking me if I would like to install ESLint. I'm just going to select the default as no. If it's asking me if I would like Tailwind CSS. Yes, we're going to be using Tailwind CSS. So I'll select yes here. The source directory, no. And the app router, this is a part of the Next.js 13 plus package. So yes, we want to use the app router. And I'll select the default for this as well. So as I do that, you guys will notice that here on the left side, we have now files and folders that have been included. I'm just going to go through these one by one here. So the very first one we have here is the app folder. Now this folder is probably the single most important folder within this Next.js project, because many of our components that we'll be using to output things such as the search form and the search results area will be based in this folder. So as I open or expand this folder, you'll see that we currently have various things here. We have a favicon.ico file, which is essentially just a favicon, which we're not going to worry about in this tutorial. Then we have our globals.css file, and this file essentially will contain all of the stylings that we'll put in this application. So let's just jump the gun here, and I'm going to get rid of some of this code, and I'm only going to leave the first 3 lines at the very top, lines 1 through 3. So I'm just going to highlight everything else, and I'm going to hit delete, and I'm going to save. Okay, and to save, the shortcut on a Mac is Command S. On a Windows, I believe it's Control S. You know, I'm OCD when it comes to saving, so just try to save everything as we make changes. Every time we make a change, just save it. Now there's another shortcut that I want to show you guys before we move along, because one thing I don't like is fishing through various files, especially when there are hundreds of them. So one thing that I do to jump between files where I'm sure about the name of the file is I hold the command button and then I type the P key. And when I do that, it opens up this menu up top. And then it has a list of various files that are a part of this project. So let's say, for example, if I wanted to open a different file, let's say layout.js, I would just type layout up here .js, and as you can see, it auto suggests the file. And then once I hit enter, it's going to open up the layout.js file for us. So that I'm going to be using that shortcut all throughout this course just to save a bit of time so I don't have to fish through different folders, but I'll definitely point out the folders that these files are located within, just for your own convenience. So this file is exactly what we want to talk about next. This is the layout.js file. And what this file does is essentially the shell of our application. It's going to contain all of the stylings and elements that our entire application will need to use on every single page. So the very first thing I'll do here, I'm not going to touch this code yet. All I'm going to do is I'm going to put my cursor over the file name on the left, layout.js, just to select it. And then I'm going to hit the enter key. And then I'm going to put my cursor to the end. I'm going to change this extension to layout.jsx. And the reason why I'm doing that is because in Next.js and in React, which is based on Next.js, actually Next.js rather is based on React, I always like to rename my component files with the extension of .jsx. It's just a better way for us to distinguish between React components or Next.js components versus regular JavaScript files. And if I were using TypeScript, then I would do the same thing. Similarly, I would rename .ts to .tsx. So that's just something that I like to do. You don't have to do it if you don't want to. It's just something I prefer to do. The layout.js, just kind of looking through this code here, we have several lines here. The very first line at the top references Google Fonts, and this is one of the newest features of Next.js 13 and 14, where we can actually have direct integration with Google Fonts. We no longer have to manually import it. It's at the very top for us to use. Then we have here a reference to our globals.css file, which again is the file that contained the stylings that we're going to be using. And then we have here the metadata. And with the metadata, I'm going to go ahead and change this right now. So what this metadata does, if you've ever done a search online, which I'm sure you have, you'll notice that when, the results that you get in Google will show a title and a description. So the title here will be this title attribute, and then obviously the description would be the description. So I'm going to change this because I would like to rank in Google. And I'm going to change this to Pokemon Profiler. So I'm going to spell it like this, Pokemon Profiler. Okay. So this is going to be the title of my web application. And then for the description, let's get rid of this. And let's say here, search Pokemon by name and get their skills and abilities. All right, something like that. You don't have to necessarily say that. If you wanted to type something else, you absolutely can. And now what that metadata object will do is that once we start to index in Google or any other search engine, is going to take this title and description information and then display this to anybody who's trying to search for our website. So it's a pretty cool and neat SEO object that we can use within Next.js. The very next thing here, which is probably the meat and potatoes of this file, is the RootLayout component. So essentially this layout.jsx file is a component. It's a Next.js component. And again, as I mentioned, this is the shell of our application. So this, the way that this works here is that we're actually passing in children as a prop or as an argument to this RootLayout file. This children represents the actual components that are underneath this. So again, this is the shell of our application. So let's say, for example, if we had a home page, the home page will be part of the children prop, and then we'll be passing in this children within this body. So the very first thing we can do here is we can make a few edits here to this. So what I'm going to do here is within this body, I'm going to take this children and I'm going to cut that out, and I'm going to make a new line. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a main element within this body. And the reason why I'm doing that is just to encapsulate the children components that's being passed in, and just to put a container around them just to make things look a little better. So let's just type here, open bracket here, main, and I'll close that. Now, if you notice, my code editor auto completes. I have an auto tag extension. I believe it's called autocomplete tag or something like that. You can do a search online, and that automatically closes the tag. I think it's auto close tag, if I'm not mistaken. But once I type this in and I close it, it automatically gives me the closing HTML tag. You can type this out if you don't want to install this extension at the moment. So I'll just open that up here to create a new line. And then I'm going to insert the children that I cut out. So this children now is going to be encapsulated by this main element. Now on this main element, I'm going to put a couple of styles. Now, as you can see, we're using, or as you saw before, we're using Tailwind CSS. And Tailwind CSS is a style framework that allows us to quickly and easily style web pages using built-in utility classes. You'll see what I mean in a second. So in order to add some styling, we're going to add a class name attribute. Now, if you're familiar with HTML and CSS, you'll know that whenever you want to add a style to a specific element, you normally in HTML would use the class equals attribute. And what that normally would do is allow you to add stylings on a particular element. However, in React and Next.js, we have to use class name, because there may be, I think that they did that in order to avoid clashes and collisions, because there's like an actual construct named class within JavaScript. So they renamed this to class name to avoid any confusion. That's my belief, at least. So we're going to use this class name attribute to give it some styling. So the first styling I want to give is a container, which is a built-in styling within Tailwind. And then next, I'm going to give some padding. Top and bottom. So here we don't do like padding, top and bottom and so on. There is a built-in utility class based on the X and Y axis within Tailwind CSS. So because we want to give it some vertical padding on the top and the bottom, we need to use PY. So we're going to use PY, which represents the Y axis, if you remember back to math class, and we're going to say PY-12. Now, why did I select 12? Look up online the Tailwind CSS documentation. There are several levels that you can use. For example, just to kind of quickly show you, if I did PY dash, I have some auto suggestions here. I have PY-0, that's essentially no margin, or rather no padding on the top and bottom. You have 1, which is very small, and it goes all the way up to 20, I believe. Yes, actually it goes up to 32. So I'm giving it somewhat of a medium amount of padding on top and bottom. That's why I chose 12. That represents a specific number of pixels, or ems, or rems. So you can find out more information about that on Tailwind CSS's documentation, which I can also leave in the video description below. All right, so we're going to be editing this file a little bit further, but for right now, I'm going to go ahead and Command S to save that. And let's go ahead and move on to the other files that we'll have to look at here. So the very next file we have here is the page.js file. This is the main homepage file that we'll be working with. And as you can see, it pre-populated some code, some HTML code. Essentially, this HTML code is called JSX in Next.js and in React. And again, Next.js is a subset of React. It's actually a server-side rendering framework that's built on top of React, the React library. And the reason why this was built is to allow applications to be more SEO friendly, but also to give the ability for applications to render on the server side, which is a lot more robust and a lot more secure in many circumstances. So we have here this home component, and it contains something that looks like HTML, but is referred to as JSX. Essentially, you write it just like HTML. As you can see, you have several attributes like class name again, and you have various stylings. What we're going to do is we're going to get rid of this code eventually, but I'm going to leave it here because I want to show you guys exactly what happens when we render this to the page. The first thing I'll do here is, again, I'll click on the page.jsx name, I'll hit the enter key, and I'll change the extension to page.jsx because this is a page component. And we want to just kind of rename that to keep things congruent between all of the components that we have here. All right, so that's what I wanted to show you. This node modules file, essentially that just contains references to any installed packages. I'm just gonna go down the line here. We have the public folder, and within this public folder, generally we would put various types of logos or, sorry, images to be more general. You would put like images, or you would put additional CSS if you wanted to. Anything you wanted to put in here that should be exposed directly on the client side to the public, you would put within this folder. The only thing we'll put within this folder is the logo, which I'll go ahead and I'll put in the GitHub repository. And you can see that in the video description. If you go to the GitHub repository, you can actually grab the logo from there, and I'll add that in shortly. All right, so let's close that up here. The getignore file, I'll just open that. As you can see here, what this file does is if you have like a GitHub repo, you can add specific references here so that your GitHub repo does not push any of these files directly to the server, so it won't be exposed in your repo. It'll basically keep those files local and unexposed. So I don't think we have to do anything there. We have this JS config file, the .json, which is used by Next.js for referencing specific links and references to packages. The most important thing that's left to show you here is the package.json file. Now this package.json file is very important because any package that we would install within Next.js would show here. It would show as either a dev dependency depending on how you configure it, or just as a dependency. As you can see, you already have React installed, we already have React DOM, and we already have Next installed. Now for this particular course, I don't believe we're going to install any special packages, but if you wanted to install a package, you would run a command npm install or npm I and then the name of the package. And you could find packages by searching npm packages online, and it'll give you a website. I believe it's the npmjs.org or something like that. And you'll be able to see various packages that you can install to make your development a lot faster. So, if you're new to this, that's pretty much how that works. It's nice and simple. But if you want to read more about the package.json file, there's plenty of documentation online to read about that. The other file, actually, now that I think of it, is because we installed Tailwind CSS within our project, we have this tailwind.config.js file. So what we have here are specific references to content that we may have installed as part of a package or dev dependency that's being referenced here, as well as background images or references to background images. So we generally won't be using this file at all, but generally if you wanted to install specific kinds of styling packages or libraries, you would come here and you would reference it here, and then you may add it as a plugin within this array below, the plugins array. And there's plenty of documentation from the providers or developers of those libraries, and they'll tell you exactly what you would need to configure in many cases. So I guess the first thing we're going to do here to move on, let me just go ahead and close out of these files. I'm just going to right click and do close all. The very first thing we're going to do here is we're going to add a few folders. Actually, we're just going to add one. So I'm going to click on app here to highlight that, and then I'm going to add a new folder. But before I do that, I'm just going to collapse that so we don't get confused. Okay, good. All right, so let's add a new folder here. So the folder we want to add is a components folder because we want to be able to separate our, or better construct and architect our code so things are nice and simple to follow. So I'm going to add a new folder here, and I'm going to call this components. You can essentially call it whatever you want. I just like to call it components. And the reason why is because React developers and Next.js developers make that part of the normal convention. So this components folder will contain various components such as our header, our search form, and probably our table is what we'll put in there as well. Okay, so the other folder I want to create, first I'm going to come out here and I'm just going to click somewhere down here so that way my root directory is selected. I'm going to create another folder on the outside of app. So do not create this within the app folder. This new folder is going to be called utils. And this utils folder will just have one file. and that file will be called helpers.js. So I'll create a new file, call it helpers.js. Now, the purpose of this file is to essentially, when we get to it, we're going to be putting some code in here that we're going to use over and over again. So we're essentially going to put a helper function that we'll use to beautify some of the content that we're outputting. And then we're going to have like a reference to our base URI for our API calls in here. But we won't do that yet. First, what we're going to work on is a bit of the homepage and also the layout. So I guess that's enough talking for now. Let's go ahead and run this just to see how this currently looks. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to clear out my terminal below. So now that I cleared out the input, what I'm going to do is run a command called npm run dev. And again, this npm command is part of your Node.js installation. So if you installed Node.js correctly, then this npm command should work. So npm run dev. And where does this command come from, by the way? Just to quickly show you, if I open up package.js on or package.json, you'll see above here, where is it? Right here within our definitions, we have this dev command right here. Okay, this is within our definitions, our scripts definition. So we have this dev command, which is next dev. So running npm run dev essentially calls this command, which then runs the application. So, all right, I just wanted to show you that in case you wanted to know, because you can also create your own commands here as well. So we won't be doing this in this course. It's out of the scope of this course, but just for you guys to know for your own knowledge. All right, so we've run that. So now let's go and let's see what this looks like in the browser. So what I'm going to do, let me just open up a new tab here, bring that over here so you folks can see it. All right, and let me just expand this here. Okay, and then I'm going to go to localhost :3000. This is where our app is. That's not running. Did I run the app? Let's try it again. Let's go back to Visual Studio Code. Okay, let me just exit out of this. I'm going to, on a Mac, I'm going to hold, Control C. Let me just clear that out again. All right, I'm going to try it again, npm run dev, and see what's going on. Something probably didn't work. Okay, it says ready. So let's go back to our browser and I'll refresh. Just takes a moment. All right, and here we have our application. Now, it's really hard to see, and the reason why is because we got rid of the styling. If you guys recall, we got rid of the styling in our globals.css file. So it's essentially on a white background, but by default, if you didn't get rid of that styling, it would show this on a dark background or a black background rather. So what we're gonna do next is, because this looks really ugly, we want to change the home page. This is the home page, so we want to change this up to look a little bit more presentable. So the first thing we're gonna do is we're gonna clean up the home page. So let's go back to Visual Studio Code, and I'm going to go to the home page. And the home page, if you guys recall, is page.jsx. So I could go here on the side, and under the app folder, I could just open up page.jsx that way. But let's use a little bit of shortcuts. So I'm going to hold on a Mac, Command, and hit the P key, and type in here page.jsx, and hit Enter. So here we have this component again, and this is the predefined styling that it comes with. Let's get rid of all of this. So I just deleted all of that. Now I'm going to create a brand new React component here. Now, I have a plugin or an extension installed in Visual Studio Code called ES7 plus React plus Redux, REDUX. Go ahead and install that if you want to be able to make components much faster. Otherwise, you can type things out as we go along. But the reason why I installed this plugin is so that I can use some quick commands to create brand new React components. So I'll show you what I mean right now. If I type in RAFCE, I get an auto-suggest from that package or the extension that I installed. And if I hit enter, it automatically creates a home page component for me. All I have to do now is just rename it. So I'm going to rename this page to home page with a capital H and a capital P. And as you can see, it renamed it on line 3 as well as line 9. So now this is looking good. And as you can see, we're importing React. Now we don't need this import anymore because I believe version 16 of React, if I recall, no longer requires this at the top because it's automatically built in by default. So I'm just going to get rid of that import statement. And here we have a brand new Next.js or React-based component. Now this homepage component will contain much of the styling we'll be working with. So let's go ahead and define some of this right now. What I'm going to do, let's see, how do we want to do this here? What we want to do, I guess what we can do is we can set up some of the skeleton first for this, and let's just kind of think through this as we go along. We'll set up some of the skeleton, and then what we're going to do is create some new components. We'll create a SearchForm component as well as a top Pokemon list component, which will house our table that you saw in the demo at the start of this video. So let's do that right now. The first thing I'm going to do here is, within this return statement, I'm just going to get rid of this default HTML that we saw here. I'm just going to fix some of this indentation. I think it's already fixed. Cool. So now I'm just going to tab over, and the first thing I'm going to do is create a React fragment. And that's just opening and closing brackets with nothing between. And I'm going to hit enter to make a new space or a new line. Now within this new line, I'm going to, let's add a section. So we'll just do section and we'll close that off. And this section here will have a class name. Hit enter that, and let's call this search section. All right, a new search section. Now we're going to have a component in here which will be the search form. So I'm just going to type that out right now. Search form. Now we obviously have not created this component yet. So if we were to look at our browser, let's go back to our browser. We should have an error. It didn't automatically reload. It should hot reload, but let me just refresh it like this. See, as you guys can see, we have an error message. It's basically saying that search form does not exist. So let's go back here. We're going to create this shortly. I'm just going to type out the code here, and then we'll go and create the components shortly for this. All right, so that will be the first section because that will be the search form and the output section that we saw in the demo. The next section we're going to create will display the actual table data. So let's create a class name attribute here. And here we're just going to call this random section. Okay, did I spell that correctly? Random section. Okay, perfect. All right, so this, one too many T's. So this section right here will display some random Pokemon, the top 10 random Pokemon. And so we're going to have a component called top Pokemon here. All right, cool. So I'll go ahead and save that. And again, that's going to error out because we don't have that component yet. So let's go ahead and create those components right now. So within our app folder, let's make sure we highlight that again, and or let's expand it, and let's go to our components folder. If you recall, we've created that. If you haven't done that, make sure you create that within the app folder. It's a subfolder within app. So within the components folder, I'm going to create a brand new file. Okay, make sure it's a file. And the first one is going to be called SearchForm, spelled exactly as it's displayed here. Capital S and capital F for inform. And we're going to say .jsx because it's a component. Hit enter. And then I'm going to use the RAFCE command to create a brand new Next.js component. So this is going to be our search form component. We can just leave that as this. And then the next component we'll create is the top Pokemon component that you saw before. So let's create a new file. We're going to call it toppokemon.jsx and hit enter, and then RAFCE, and now we have our top Pokemon component. All right, so that's looking good. So we have our components all ready to go here. We should not see any error messages if I go back. Let's double check that. Let's refresh. We do still see an error message for search form. Let's see. Let's go back to search form. Are we spelling that correctly? Search form, search form, search form. And below we have search form. Okay. All right. I guess as we work through it, it'll go away. I'm not really sure why that's happening. Oh, I know why. Because we haven't brought them in yet. We actually have to import them. So let's go back to our page.jsx homepage component. So I'm back here in this component, and what we have to do, because we're using these components here, we have to actually import the references to these components. So let's go ahead and do that right now. So at the very top of our file, we're going to type up here import, and the first one we'll import is our SearchForm. So it's going to give me autocomplete here, but if you don't get it, if you don't get an autocomplete or an auto suggestion, make sure you type it exactly as it's showing here. Import SearchForm from, and then either double quotes or single quotes, /components/SearchForm. And I like to put a semicolon at the end. So that's going to be the first one. Then the next one we're going to bring in is the TopPokemon component, like that. All right, so now the error messages should go away. And as you can see, we're rendering both components. It's just rendering as text right now. So trust me, this is not the end of it. This is just the very beginning. All right, cool. So now that we have those components, we're good to go there. Now there is one more component that we definitely need to add here, and that's going to be our header component, because if you recall, in the demo that we did, we actually had a header component within our application. So let's go ahead and let's add that header component right now. Again, we're going to go back to components. So let's expand app components, and I'm going to add a brand new file called header.jsx. Where is it? Okay, so header.jsx, and we're going to do RAFCE here. And now we have our header component. So if I go back to my home page, as you can see, header should be rendering. Actually, not yet. What we want to do is we're going to render the header right now. So let's go back, and where we want to render it is we want to the header to be shown on any page that any current page that we have and any future page. So the very best place to put this is in our layout.jsx file. So I'm going to go here and I'm going to type layout.jsx. And as you guys recall, we already started working with this file, so we just need to make a quick change here. So I'm gonna what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna bring in the header. So at the very top, I'm going to bring in the header that we just created. So import header. So that imports that from the components folder, and let's just add a semicolon to the end. And at the very bottom here, within our body, but above the main tag, I'm going to add that header reference. So header tag right here, and save. So now if I go back to the view, as you can see up top, we see the header. So that's pretty much how that works. So next up, what we're going to do is add a couple of fonts to our application. So let's go back to our Next.js project in Visual Studio Code. And what we're going to do is, as you recall, we're importing this enter font here. We're going to change this to two completely different fonts and use both fonts in our application. One font will be responsible for rendering the heading or the headings that we'll use, like the H1, H2, and H3s, and the other font will be for our paragraph text. So within this reference, this enter reference, I'm going to get rid of enter, the word enter, and I'm going to bring in two Google fonts. One is going to be called Bangers, and then we're going to add a comma after that, and the other one's going to be Lato, which is a very popular one that's used all over the internet. Okay, so now that I brought in those two fonts, let's see, what do we want to do next? Let's go ahead and define the objects for these fonts. So we're already kind of doing that right here. You know what? I'm just going to go ahead. I'm just going to get rid of this reference right here. I'm going to type this from scratch. So for the bangers, what we're going to do is we're going to say const for constant bangers, because we're going to instantiate a font object that we can use and pass into our layout, our root layout, which will then we can then render on the page as we see fit. So essentially, Lato will be our default, or maybe we'll make bangers our default. Either one of them will be our default, and then we can just kind of override the other one as we need to. So we're going to reference our bangers font object, and this is actually a function, so we're going to need to pass it an object. So I'm going to add left and right curly braces within this method call. I'm going to hit enter, and I'm going to add a semicolon to the end. Now within this is expecting a couple of arguments or a couple of attributes within this object. The first attribute that's expected here is a subsets attribute. So I'm going to type subsets, and then we're going to give it an array, and that array will just contain the word Latin. You can actually pass multiple subsets here, but Latin is by far the most popular one because most of the languages we'll be working with, in this case, we'll only be working with one, which is just English, is based on a Latin sort of origin. So let's just add a comma here because the very next one that we're going to give it is going to be weight. So this represents the font weight that we want to use as our default. Now the Bangers font only comes with one font weight, and that's 400. If you're not sure exactly what this means, just reference Google Fonts online. There's plenty of documentation published by Google on what these font weights look like. But essentially, font weight 400 is a normal font boldness. All right, so now the last one we'll give it here, let's give it a variable. Now, the reason why we're giving it a variable attribute is because we want to be able to use this variable within our global CSS file. And then we'll be able to reference that variable and we'll be able to kind of assign the styling from this Bangers directly to one of our classes that we'll use. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a double hyphen here, and I'm going to say font dash Bangers. And that's how we define a variable. And I'll also give it a comma at the end in case we want to add more attributes in the near future. All right, so that's going to be our first font object. The second one is going to be our lato. So we're going to do something similar. We're going to say const lato, capital L for the lato function, and then we're going to pass in curly braces within this method call. All right, and then what we're going to do is we're going to do the same thing. We're going to have subsets, and that's going to be an array, and we're going to pass in Latin as well. And then the weight for lato, let's give it 2 weights. So we're going to give it the normal 400. Now this is going to be within an array, guys, so make sure you put these arguments within the array, these indexes. So we're going to have 400 weight, and then we're going to give it a 700 weight, which is somewhat semi-bold. So that's going to look nice and pretty for us. And then we're going to give it again a variable. All right, and this variable will be similar. It'll be dash dash font dash lato. All right, and we'll add a comma. So that's going to basically define our font objects. Now what we want to do next is, if I scroll down here to our HTML section, you'll notice that down here we're actually by default within the body tag we're passing a font. Prior we were passing the enter font, which is here. So obviously we're going to get rid of that, and what we're going to do is, instead of passing this class name of enter, we're going to be passing in our variable names here. We're going to pass in the Bangers variable, we're going to pass in the lato variable. So let's go ahead and get rid of this here. And what I want to do is I'm going to use some backticks like that. So make sure you use backticks, because these backticks will allow us to concatenate or interpolate certain expressions within a string, so that way we could render dynamic values within this string. So to do that, we use the backticks, and then we're going to use a $sign. Where are you, $sign? Oh geez, can't type today. $sign, there we go. All right, and then so the very first value we'll give it here is Bangers, because that's our variable that we declared above, and we're going to say Bangers dot variable, because if you recall, we defined that above. So that's basically going to paste in that class within this class name attribute. And then the second one, similarly, is going to be lato dot variable. All right, so that should do that. I think we would be done. I think we're done with this file. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to close out of all these tabs so we don't get confused. Now, so far with that change, there's nothing to see. So the next step we're going to do is we're going to actually import a lot of the stylings that we need to define. Now, for brevity of this course, I'm not going to type out every single style for you guys. What I'm going to do is, in the link in the description below, there will be a link to the GitHub repo, as I mentioned. And if you go to that GitHub repo and you look within the globals.css file, which is within the app directory, you should be able to copy all of the CSS that we need for this project from that file specifically. So that way we could just quickly get to the meat and potatoes, which is coding within Next.js. So what I'm doing here off screen is I'm just copying that those designs, and here I'm going to open up globals.css. Just gonna get rid of this, and I'm gonna paste in all of our styles. So let's just kind of take a quick skim through everything here. So I pasted in all of the styles that we need, and here, the very first thing we've done here is outside of our layers, we've defined a couple of classes. So we have here the HTML and body tags as selectors, and so that means that any styling that we'll add on top of these selectors or these elements, which is essentially the entire document or the entire page, will contain this font family attribute, letter spacing, and the font weight. So what we've done is we're basically defaulting all fonts to Lato, the Lato theme, the Lato font. Because if you guys recall, we defined this variable --font -Lato. We did that in the layout.jsx file, and now we can actually reference it here like this, using the var function within CSS. So that's what we've done here. So anything that we output, unless we specify the bangers class or the font-bangers class on an element, is going to output it as the Lato font. So down below here, we have this dot font-bangers, as I mentioned, and we're doing something similar where we have this var function in CSS, and we're passing font-bangers here. So that means that anytime we give this font-bangers as our class name on an element, it's going to take in this bangers font and render the text using that font. And then, of course, we give it some letter spacing of 1 pixel. Now, the rest of this styling below is essentially Tailwind CSS. Okay, actually, the loader here in the spinner is basic CSS. But if I jump down further, we defined a couple of base layers. And where this comes from, this @layer base here on line number 40, if we look at the very top of our file on line number 1, we have an @tailwind base. And basically, these are layers or references, or I guess the proper term is directives in Tailwind, that we can annotate here, and we can define specific stylings based on the kind of attribute or the kind of component it is. Now the base represents every single element like HTML, body, div, paragraph tag, and so on, that we set as our base stylings within the application. Whereas the components and the utilities, the components is basically any custom class like .font-bangers, for example, that we've defined here, as well as the utilities is the built-in utilities classes that come with Tailwind. We can actually overwrite the styling of those classes. Now, we're not going to be using the utilities layer at all in this course. I just wanted to explain that to you in case you had any questions. So if I go down here, let's just take a look. So as you can see here, we've done, so we have here this @base, and then we've defined some default styles that we'll have on the H1, H2, and H3 elements. So I've just given it some Tailwind classes. So text 3XL, which is 3 times the size of XL. And then we have here text center to just center the text in the middle of the page, for example. And then we have a font bold on this H1, which will bold in the font. And then PB-4 is padding bottom -4. And again, the -4, you'll have to reference the Tailwind CSS documentation to know exactly how many pixels that represents. Then the same thing similar to the H2 and H3 elements, we're designing that. We have here the header element that we just add a background blue color to it, blue-700, that's an intensity. So with the colors of backgrounds and text, you actually have intensities ranging from 50 all the way up for some colors to 900. So basically, the higher the number, the darker the color, the less the number, or the lower the number, the lighter the hue of the color. So right here, I'm giving it a pretty fairly darker blue background. And then we have the PY-3, which is giving padding top bottom of level 3 on this element. So we have a bunch of other styling. I suggest that you guys just kind of take a look through this file. I'm not going to go through each and every one of these stylings. Just look through all of these styles here and the elements being referenced, the selectors and so on, just to become acclimated to what I'm doing here. Let's just kind of go back to the code where we were to just kind of continue moving on here, because there's quite a bit to cover. So I'm going to close out of this file here. Let's see here. I think the next thing that we want to do is let's go back to our page.jsx and see how that looks. So in our page.jsx, As you can see here, we've already defined the class name as search section. In our Tailwind global.css file that we just closed, there's actually a custom class that I defined that contains the styling for these divs. All right, so that should be good to go here. Cool. So yeah, the next thing I want to do is I want to go ahead and create that helpers.js file that we're going to be using. Because what we need to do is we need to define a base URI that is going to be part of our API callout. So we're going to be referencing that several times within the application to make essentially two different API callouts, one for the client component and one for the server component. And then we need to define or declare a new function that we're going to export out to beautify the results of various string elements that we're going to be passing in. So let me just open up the command P, and I'm going to open up that helpers.js file, and you'll see exactly what I mean in a second. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to export that, that base URI. So it's going to be export const base underscore URI, and let's just set that equal to an empty string for now. Now what we want to do is let's go back to our browser really quickly here. We're going to be using an API called the PokeAPI. So if I go here and I type in PokeAPI.co, not .com, PokeAPI.co, it'll take me to this website here. And this is the PokeAPI. Now within this API, we can actually make free API calls, as many as we wish, and we don't need an API key. It's completely open. It's an open public API. So it gives us an example here. Essentially, this HTTPS pokeapi.co/API/v2 is going to be our base URI. This is going to be it right here. So I'm just going to copy that. So I'm going to copy down. Let's go back to Visual Studio Code. After we've copied that base URI, we're going to come back here. We're going to just paste it right here. Let's get rid of the last slash at the end, because that last slash we're going to just add as part of our endpoint. So let's go back to our website here. Let's just kind of play around. So as you can see, it automatically loaded an example based on this form submission. And this is going to be the JSON that's going to get returned from the API back to our application. And this is based on the Pokemon of Ditto. I'm not sure if that's an actual Pokemon. I think this might just be a test example for people to look at. But as you can see, we have different attributes. What gets returned is abilities as an array of abilities. So if I just collapse that, you'll see the other attributes here that we have. We have our base experience attribute. And we have, if I scroll down the line, you should have images here. Yeah, species, which, what kind of Pokemon it is. The type, is it electric gas? Grass, not gas. Electric grass, and so on. So yeah, this API gives a lot of information that we're going to be working with, and we're just essentially going to be parsing this JSON and rendering out specific values based on the what we need in the application. So let's go back to our code here in Visual Studio. Where are you? Oops. All right, cool. All right, so again, that's our base URI. The second thing, and the only other thing we need in this file, is a beautify function. So we're going to do export const beautify, and that's going to be equal to, we're going to give it a string. So we're going to be passing a string that will send in from the caller. So the string might be something like a Pokemon name, or it can be like an ability. And I'll tell you why in a second. Let's just complete this function. So this is going to be an arrow function. So we're going to type here =, and then a greater than sign. And then we're going to open and close our curly braces like that. And this is an arrow function in JavaScript. Now, the reason why we need this function beautify is because the API returns raw data. So it returns back, like, for example, if Pikachu's ability is electric shock, instead of returning electric shock in a beautified format, which would be like capital E in electric and capital S in shock with a space in between, it normally would return back electric shock like this. So, and we don't want that. I mean, we could use that, but we want to just kind of beautify things a little bit, so that way it returns it back sort of like this, right? We want it to look more like that. So let's go ahead and write the code to do that. So the first thing here is I'm going to just define a new variable called new string and set that equal to an empty string. Then let's go ahead, and what we're going to do is we're going to split on the dashes. So if the string contains any dashes, we want to split that into separate array elements. So that way we can then modify and edit, or rather manipulate, each string within each array index. So I'm going to say const strr, standing for string array, and that's going to be equal to str.split, and I'm going to say we're going to split on the dash or the hyphen. Cool. Now we're going to say let's say str array, and what we're going to do is we're going to loop through each array element. So we're going to use the for each function within JavaScript, and we're going to say s here, and we're going to do arrow function, opening and closing curly braces, semicolon at the end. Now within this, let's see. First, what we want to do is we're going to check to make sure that this is not an empty string. Okay, so we're going to say if the new string, and the reason why we're going to do this, I'll tell you why in a second. If this is not an empty string, the new string is not an empty string, I'm going to say new string plus and equals a space. All right. Now, what this code is going to do, folks, is imagine, for example, that we've already populated the new string variable. Let's say because we're looping through this essentially, right? So at some point, new string will not be an empty string. It will actually have text in it. So in the event that we already have text assigned to new string, the new string variable, what we want to do is add a space at the very end of that string. So that way we can add the next word to the end, or append the next word to the end of that white space character. So that way things will look nice and beautified. All right, so that's why we're doing that here. So then the next line here, in the event that in any event rather. So let's imagine that it is a brand new string and we don't have any text assigned to this. We're going to say new string is equal to, or actually I'm going to say plus and equal to, because we want to concatenate that, s.char at, and we want to say this, take the first letter character in that string. So in the case of electric, we're going to take the E, and we're going to say dot to uppercase. That's a function that's built into JavaScript, folks. And then we're going to say plus s dot slice, and we're going to slice on the second character, which is within the first index, okay, or the index of 1. So what this is going to do, what this line does here is going to capitalize the first character in the string, in the s variable that's part of our loop variable here, and then is going to slice the rest from that string and just append it to the end. So that's what that code does here. All right, and you'll see how this works later on. So I'm just going to return the new string value, and that's pretty much it, guys. Like, this is going to beautify our text and make things look nice and nice and good within the table data, as well as within the SearchForm result data. All right, so now what I'll do is I'll go ahead and close this out like that. So pretty much our helpers are done. Page.jsx, that's pretty much done. All right, so I think the next thing we'll do is we'll work on our header next. So let's go ahead and open up header.jsx. So what we have so far is this. So first I want to fix some indentation here. Let's do that. I think we're good here with indentation. And I'm going to get rid of this here. All right, so a few things I want to do. Guys, go ahead and pause the video, because what I want to do next is I want to bring in that the logo, the Pokemon logo, again, which is protected by copyright. We're just doing this for demonstration purposes only. So go to the GitHub repo in the link below. Go to the app folder, or actually it's in the public folder, because it's going to be an image that's going to get exposed to the public. So then go within the public folder and download that logo. Go ahead and pause the video and do that. So after you've downloaded the logo, put it within your public folder. So as you can see here, in my public folder, I have this Pokemon-logo.png file, and it's rendering out here. So yeah, make sure you add that within your public folder so we can reference that within our application. So I'm gonna go ahead and close out of this image file and head back over to my header.jsx. All right, let's start kind of building some stuff so we can see something on the page. So let's build our header. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to use the basic out-of-the-box HTML header element to add a header to our page. And so far, there's no, we've added the styling to that. We don't need to add any additional styling here because it's all within our global.css file or globals.css file. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add a new div. Oops, I misspelled that. Let's try that again. So div, opening, closing, and I'm going to give that a class name. And we have a navbar class within our globals.css. So we're going to give it navbar. Okay. All right. So within this navbar, I'm going to add an image within it. And that image is going to be the logo. So let's type here a capital I for image because we're going to bring in our next image component here. So now, as you can see, my auto-suggest is giving me this right here, next/image. So I'm going to select that one and hit enter and just close this tag out. And as you can see here on line number 1 above is automatically importing import image from next/image. Now, the reason why we need to use this, we could just use the regular IMG one that is part of the HTML framework, but we're going to use the image that's provided by Next.js, and because then the images will be far more optimized specifically for Next.js projects. So it's preferred and recommended, in fact, for you to use this one instead of the other. All right, so let's go ahead and define a couple of attributes on this. And then what we're going to need to do afterwards is whenever we're using this tag, we need to actually edit our next.config.js file because we're going to be using external images in the future as well once we render our API images. For this one, we don't necessarily need to do that, but we'll go ahead and configure our next.config.js file right after this, so that way we have that out the way. So I'm just going to move this down to the next line here and define a few attributes on this image element. So the first one I'll define is required for you to have a height. I'm going to give this one a height of 200. And then next we'll need to define a width as well. And we'll give that a width of 200 to make it nice and squared. So we're basically going to keep the aspect ratio the way it is. Then we're going to say a source here, and the source is going to be, now again, we have this within our public folder. So that just means we just need to say slash and then the name of the file, which was Pokemon-logo.png, I believe, right? If I do a command, I can check real quick. Yes, Pokemon-logo.png. So yeah, because this is within our public folder, we don't need to say /public. We just need to say slash and then the name of the file. Now, if we had a subfolder within public, let's say an images file or folder, we would say /image/ and then the name of the file. So that should be fine the way it is. I'm going to give this an alt, and we're going to call this just logo, just good practice for accessibility purposes. And then lastly, I'm going to give this a priority, and we're going to set that equal to true. Now, what this attribute does is it tells Next.js that this image should be loaded according to priority, right? And generally, any image that appears above the fold of the page, so meaning any image that appears at the top of the page without the need to scroll down the page, you should set a priority of true just to optimize the image's rendering. So I think we're good there. Let's see. Yeah, I think we're good with the image part of this. Now the next part of it, as you recall in the demo, is we need to render out the text, which was the profiler text. So to do that, actually before we do that, we're going to add a quick little trademark here just to protect our YouTube channel. So we're going to add a small tag here. And let's see, what do we want to put within a small tag? We're going to define a class name first. and let's give it a text of small. All right, because what we're going to do is we're going to render out the TM trademark that's found, especially in American trademarked products, just to protect ourselves. So now the next thing we're going to do is, instead of just typing TM like this, we're going to use an escape character in HTML, and that's going to be, where are you? The ampersand trade and semicolon. So we're going to do it the and symbol trade semicolon. That's going to render out the TM, which represents trademark. And then we're going to render out a non-breaking space. So we're going to do another and symbol, NBSP, for a non-breaking space, because we just want to put a little bit more space between the two. Now we could just use styling for this, but just for a quick little fix here, I'm just going to add that non-breaking space to add an additional white space between this trademark and the rest of the logo. All right, or the rest of the text of the logo, rather. Okay, and then the next thing we're going to do here is we're going to add a span tag. And let's see, what do we want to add in this span tag? We're going to do add the profiler text that you saw in the demo. And let's go back here, and we're going to give this a class name. And I think here will be the first time we're going to use our font dash bangers, because we want to give that bangers font, which is a sort of a cartoonish, playful font. And you'll see how that looks shortly. So yeah, we're going to use that font bangers. And again, as you guys recall, in our globals.css, we're using that variable, that dash font dash bangers that we defined, and we assigned that to a font dash bangers class. And that's what we're putting right here to output this using that font. All right, so I think we're good with the header. I think that's good. Let's see if this is going to render. We may have some errors. Let's see. So let's go back to our browser. And where were we? This PokeAPI. Boom. So as we have it here, yeah, it looks like that's rendering. But one thing that looks incorrect here is it looks like we're not using that new font here. So we need to go back and check a few things. But so far the logo looks good and the TM trademark looks good. So let's go back here. Let's see. And I think the first thing I'll look at here is if I go back to my layout.jsx file. Let's scroll up top here. All right, so first I'm going to just look through this and see. So we have bangers is equal to bangers, subsets, Latin, okay, variable dash font dash bangers. That's correct. So now if I scroll down here, I just want to make sure I'm putting this on the body. So bangers dot variable. Something's wrong here. I'm missing the A in variable. There you go. You guys didn't catch that? All right, so now we have it, and there we go. So boom, now we got the bangers font. Look how great that looks, guys. So the header is pretty much done. That's all that's done so far. Okay. All right, so the next thing we want to do here, I'm not sure why that popped up. The next thing we want to do here is we want to do let's do the search form, because that's a very important part of this, right? So we want to be able to create the search form, and that's going to essentially be our client component, right? It's going to be we're going to be using the search form to create a client component, which will then fetch information based on the form submission that we give it, because we're essentially going to be typing in, the user. We're going to allow the user to type in a keyword or the name of a Pokemon, and then that's going to go out and make an API call to return the Pokemon data based on the form submission. So first we're going to work with the client component side of Next.js 14, and then thereafter we're going to work with the server side. So let's go back to our Visual Studio here. Okay, cool. I'm just going to go ahead, I'm going to close out of this and out of this. And I'm going to open up our, what do we need? We need our search form component. Cool. So there's going to be quite a bit of coding here, so just bear with me. Feel free to pause the video if something doesn't make sense to you. All right, so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of line number 1. As I said, we don't need it. And the first thing we need to do is, because we're working with a client component, we want to make this a client component, which makes this sort of, we can load the data dynamically after page load. we need to specify an annotation at the very top of our file. This applies to Next.js 13 and 14, and possibly to future versions as well. So to make this a client component, we just need to use single quotes, use client, and a semicolon. Now that automatically converts this to a client component, and in this component now we can utilize the typical React and Next.js properties such as the useState hook that we'll use to kind of keep track of the state of values within the application. All right, so now what we want to do is we're going to have a few imports in this file. First, I'm going to bring in that base URI that we define in our helpers file, so that way we'll have access to this here so we can make our API call. Now I'm also going to bring in that image, the next image component or reference again, because we're going to render out the image, which will be the image of the Pokemon. Okay, let's see. Let's also, you know what I'm going to do also is we're going to need to have a loader within this application. Now the loader will display on two different occasions. This loader, which will be a spinner, will be displayed whenever the server component is between page requests. So when we first load the page, the spinner will show until the results get returned. The second circumstance will be when we're working with this client component and we're submitting the form. We want to be able to display a spinner until the results come back to our application. So to do that, what I love about Next.js 13 and 14 is we no longer have to go through a lot of complication to work with spinners. What we can do is, within our app folder, so let's go back to app here on the left, we can create a new page. So I'm going to click the new file icon here, and I'm going to type in here loading.jsx, and it must be called loading.jsx, and I'm going to hit enter. And again, guys, this is a page, but we're still going to use an RAFCE component here to load this here. And then I'm just going to change this to loading with a capital L. Okay. Now this page is essentially going to be our spinner component, and this again will be displayed depending on what kind of component. It's going to be displayed between requests. Okay, depending on the component, whether client side or server side. Excuse me. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to again get rid of this import React. And I don't think we need to bring in any imports anyway, so I'm just going to move this up top here. And now I'm going to get rid of this here as well. All right, I'm going to fix this indentation. Perfect. All right, now within our return statement, I'm going to create a new div. So I'm going to say div, and I'm going to open and close that. I misspelled div. I'm not sure why my D key is not working. Maybe I just need to press it harder. Okay, good. So that's fixed. Now, I'm going to put a class name on this. And I've already predefined the classes within the globals.css file. So the first class here will be called loader, I believe. Yes, loader. Okay. And this is going to be sort of the background, the outer shell of our spinner. Because when the loader or the spinner renders, it's basically going to make the background kind of like transparent, or rather a little bit see-through white background, just to kind of give it a nice little added effect. And then the next one here will be another div, and I'm going to give that a class named spinner. Right? And again, that styling is defined in globals.css, and that's pretty much it for that. That's probably the simplest file we'll work with here. So basically, the way this works again is that this loading.jsx will get rendered between page requests or between form submission requests. All right, so I'm going to close out this now. Now that we took care of that, what I need to do is I need to bring this in. So I need to say import loading. Input loading, and from that loading component. Perfect. All right, so hopefully that made sense to you guys. All right, so now I'm trying to think, what else do we need to bring in here? We need to bring in that beautify function. Let's bring in beautify. Actually, what we can do is, because we're already bringing in base URI up here, we can just say, oops, losing my cursor. Okay, so we can just say comma beautify like that. All right. So now we're bringing in beautify and base URI from our helpers file. And again, that method is going to be used to just kind of make our text look a little prettier. Lastly, I'm going to bring in our useState hook, which is part of the React package. And the reason why we're doing that is we're going to be working with values across the application that can be updated dynamically. So we need to be able to track those values and make reactive adjustments accordingly. If that makes absolutely no sense to you, don't feel scared. I'll explain it all shortly. You'll see how it works. All right, so excuse me, I guess what we can do is let's start working with some. First thing I'm going to do for now is I'm just going to get rid of this. I'm just going to make this a React fragment, an empty tag like that, and I'm just going to move this down a couple of notches, and on line number 9 I will start my code. So the first thing I want to do is I want to keep track of the keywords that the user is typing into the form. So this is going to be part of our React state. So I'm going to say const. We're going to define a new state called keyword, comma, set keyword. And we're going to set that equal to whatever gets returned from the useState function or hook. And that's going to be of a data type of empty string or just string. Now what this means here is essentially this first variable keyword is going to be how we're going to access the value of the state. So it's essentially like a variable. We're, within this application, this file, we could just say keyword, and it's going to output whatever's in that variable, whatever value is stored to that variable. Now this set keyword is our setter, and this is basically what we're going to use as a function call to store values to our state. All right, so you'll see that shortly. And again, we're going to define another state here. We're gonna need a state that keeps track of our search results. So after we submitted the form, what do we display? So we're going to say search result here, and everything must, every single accessor will start with set, or every setter will start with set search result like that. And we're going to set that equal to useState. And for this, the result can either be one of two data types. It can either be an object like that, or it could be a string like that. Since I really don't know what could be returned, because if it's an error message, it may be a string, and if it's a valid request returning with a 200, it could be an object. So I'm just going to set that equal to null for now, because we're really not sure, and I don't want to have to use a lot of type of references to find out. So let's just set that to null. All right, the next one, we need one more state, and that's going to be for our loader. So we're going to say const loading and then set loading. And we're going to set that equal to useState, and that's going to be a default Boolean value of false. All right, so I think that defines our state. Next, what we need to do is, bring that up there. Next, what we need to do is we need to define our handler. I'm just going to put a shell of a handler. This is going to be our form submission handler. So I'm going to put a shell, and I'm going to call that handle submit. And that's going to be equal to the event object that we pass in, and it's going to be an arrow function. So this E variable that gets passed in here is the event object. So whenever we submit a form, that's essentially an event. Now this event object would contain the values that's submitted in the form. However, what I'm going to do is I'm going to access the keyword using the state that we defined above. So instead of using the event object, you can use the event object if you wish. I just think that because it's a simple form, I'm just going to use the state. Plus, it's better practice so that we can, keep track of what the state is more easily. Now, for now, what I'm going to do in this method, we're going to come back and define everything we need to define, including the API calls here. There are two things I'm going to just add right now. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make this method async. And the reason why I'm doing that is because we're going to be making an asynchronous API call to the PokeAPI. So we need to be able to handle that request asynchronously, because we're not quite sure exactly when the request will be returned, or the response rather will be returned back to us. So we just mark this as async, and we await the response to be returned from the server. The second thing I'm going to do is this E object, this event object. What I want to do is I want to avoid running the default behavior of form submission. So the default in like a regular form is that when you submit a form, like if it's like a basic HTML form and you click the submit button, it would automatically try to redirect the user to an action page or a different URL to handle the form submission based on the method that it's given. I don't want to do that. I want to use pure JavaScript to handle my form submission. So what I need to do is I need to prevent default on this object by using the e.preventDefault function, like that. So that automatically stops any default form submission behavior within our application. So I'll go ahead and save that so far. And again, we're going to come back to this. So I'm just going to make a couple of new lines here like that. And let's move on. Okay, so what else do we need in this application? I guess what we can do before we move on to the actual markup here is let's go ahead and use that loader. So we're going to say if loading, if we're loading this request, right, then we want that spinner to display full page. So to do that, we're going to say here return, and then we're going to bring in that spinner. So we're going to say loading like that and semicolon. That's it. So basically, if the loading state is equal to true, then we're going to just output the loader. Otherwise, if it's false, it'll be hidden. It won't even render this line here. Okay. All right, so that was quite a bit of talking here, talking through that. Let's move on to some of the markup. All right, so we're gonna create the search form. We already have the stylings in the globals.css. So let's go ahead and create some of the elements, the HTML elements here. So first, I'm gonna have a div within the React fragment element. And I'm going to give that a class name, and we have a SearchForm custom class that we defined to give it some styling here. So it's going to be SearchForm here. And first we're going to use an H1 element, which also has its own styling, but I'm going to add additional styling to that. I'm going to set the font Bangers font so we can give it some pop. And here we're going to say search Pokemon by name, right? Yeah, search Pokemon by name. Now this Bangers font by default displays everything in uppercase. So it doesn't matter if I type it all lowercase, all uppercase, or mixed case. It doesn't matter. Everything is uppercase. So there's no need for us to, uppercase everything ourselves manually. So the next thing we're going to do is let's create a form here. Let's see. So let's just add a form element. And on this form element, instead of giving it an action like we would normally do in other programming languages, in JavaScript, we can give it an onSubmit handlers like this. So onSubmit and hit enter. And what this onSubmit expects is an actual function, a callback function, that will be the event handler. So we're going to pass that handle submit function that we started defining above. So basically, when this form submits based on the button click of the submit button, it's going to call this handler and then run the code to make the API call out to the API service. So that's how that's going to work. All right, so let's see. I guess what we can do now is we can go ahead and start defining our input values or our input field. So let's give it an input field, and that's going to be a self-closing HTML tag, and we're going to define a couple of attributes here. So the first one we're going to define is a type, of course, and a type is going to be equal to text because we just want this to be a text input. So the user will input this, the user here will input the keyword, which will be the Pokemon name here. So the next attribute will be name, and that will be keyword, right? Because we want to be able to reference that. Now, this is really not important for this tutorial, but let's say, for example, if you were to grab the value of this input using the event object above, then you would essentially do like e.target and then the name of this. So e.target.keyword to grab the value. In this case, I want to make things simpler. I'm just going to use the state, so I'm not going to use the event object, but I'm still going to put this here in case you guys want to toy around with that at some point in the future. All right, so let's go ahead and define a value, and the value will be keyword, which is going to be our state, because what we want to do is every time the user types in a letter, we're automatically updating our state to keep things intact and to keep things updated within the state of our application. The next attribute will be the onChange event handler. And so what we're going to do here is, again, as we type letters into our input field, we want to be able to update our state. So to do that, we need to pass an anonymous function. So we're going to do it like this. We're going to do an opening and closing parentheses, and we're going to pass that event object like this. Then we're going to do an equal sign, greater than sign, and now we're going to call our React state set method or setter method. We're going to say set keyword as we defined above, opening, closing parentheses, and now we're going to use the event object that we're passing in. So we're going to say e.target.value, and that's basically going to keep our state updated. All right, so let's see, what else do we need? I guess we can give it a placeholder like we saw in the demo. So let's say placeholder, and this placeholder text will be just search Pokemon by name, okay, and 3 dots, okay. And now lastly, we want to make this field required, and we want to do that because we don't want the user just submitting requests without any input. We only want them to submit the request if the field is required. Now, this is usually one half of the equation when you're dealing with form validation. Normally, you would set this as required, and then on your form submission event, you would normally have additional validation validation logic that would just kind of check for the value of keyword. In this case, we're just going to kind of take the easy route out and just slap on the required attribute here. But I would suggest that in a real life application, you have additional validation code that would check for the value of keyword, or the value of the state rather, and then essentially display an error message if it's null or empty or something like that, okay? Or undefined in some cases. All right, so that should do it for the input. Now we need to define our button. So let's say button, and that's going to be a closing, and we're going to just say between these tags go and exclamation mark like that. And now we're going to give it some styling. So the styling we want to give this is just BTN, and we're going to use that font bangers font on top of that for the button text. So now that should give us our button and the text, button styling and the text. All right, so I think that's it for the form. Let's see, I think that should be it. Because now what we want to do is we want to now display the output of the form or the result. So let's create another div. Actually, you know what? Before we do that, let's go ahead and render this. Let's see what happens here. Let's see if we get an error message. We should not, but okay, is it good? Perfect. We got our form here. All right, so we've got our form, and it's looking good out the box because of our styling. So good. All right, let's continue. So let's go back to Visual Studio Code. Now what we want to do is under this form, we need to be able to display any sort of output, because if we were to submit this form right now, nothing would happen because we haven't wired up our API code, nor have we built our output panel. So let's go ahead and do that. So let's create another div down here, and I'm just going to say div, okay, like that, and we're going to give this a class name of search result, like that. All right, so within this, what we want to do is we want to check if search result has a value, and if it has a value, then we're going to work with, we're going to manipulate the elements. If it does not have a value, we want to skip this block altogether. That's why we're using the double and symbol or the double ampersand, because if this, for instance, is undefined or if it's null, it'll completely skip this block. All right. All right, so within here, let's see. I think what we, again, as I mentioned, this API can return an object or a string. So first, let's do a type of check, because what we want to do is we want to check first if this search result is basically an object. So if type of search result is equal to object, question mark, because this is sort of like doing an if-else statement here. So we're basically like saying if the type of search result is equal to object, then we're going to do something. And just before I complete that section, I'm just going to go down to the bottom here to the ending parentheses, and I'm going to finish this out here, this chain, so that way we don't get confused later on. So now if it is not an object, what we need to do now is check if it is a string. Okay, so we're going to say if the type of search result is equal to, I guess we could say if this is just equal to string. And instead of doing like an else statement here, I'm just going to end the trail here. So I'm going to do a double and symbol to end this, because this will be the last condition. And we're going to do closing parentheses, opening and closing, and that. And let's just put some empty tags in there for now. We're going to come up here and finish this one first. All right. So let's go ahead and put some comments here. So we're going to say here, we're going to say that we're going to run this if the JSON response is an object. And this one down here will be if the JSON response is a string, just so we know exactly what it is, what we're dealing with. All right, so in the case of the JSON response being an object, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to open up this fragment here. Let's see what we want to do. Now, more than likely what we want to do here is that if it's an object, we just want to output the image, we want to output the attributes as we saw in the demo. All right, so to do that, let's work with the image first. So we're going to bring in that image with a capital I, and we're going to close that, and we're going to just make some space, bring that closing tag down here, and we're going to add some attributes. So the first one's going to be source, and the source, now this is going to point to an external link. And the reason why is because this is getting returned from the API, and the API actually stores the images, I believe, on GitHub. So we'll need to edit our next.config file so that way we can use the external images with this image tag. Okay, so we're going to say, now that value will be in search result, the state of search result, and I believe it will be in sprites. Search result sprites. And I'm going to try to show you that, guys, this in the API shortly. Search result sprites dot front default, something like that. All right, now where am I getting this from? Let's go back to our browser. We may see some error messages on the application. That's fine. All right, so back in our browser here, there is, I was playing around with this before. So if I go to PokeAPI.co/ what is it again? Wait, what is it again? Let's go back. PokeAPI/co. Oops. All right. Yeah, so PokeAPI.co/API/v2. All right, so let me just leave this open here, and I'm going to go to PokeAPI.co/API/v2/Pokemon/ let's say Pikachu, and hit enter. And again, I don't need an API key for this. That's why this is going to work. Oops, I'm not sure what happened there. It took me someplace totally different. Let's go back here. Let me just grab this like this again. Can't just grab it easily. All right, like this. Copy. And let's try this again. I'm not sure what happened there. All right. So it should be at Pokemon. Let's just try that. Okay, good. So now we're seeing a response. This is a response of all the Pokemon, but as you can see, we don't have many attributes here. It's just giving us the Pokemon objects. But what I want to do is I want to see more details about Pikachu. So I'm going to say /Pikachu. All right, so now this is Pikachu's data, guys. So as you can see in this JSON here, we have abilities. I showed this before with Ditto, but essentially we have abilities and we have various different types of key value pair definitions here. So what I want to do is I want to see exactly where this sprites object is. So yep, we have it right here. So as you can see right here, we have the sprites, which is an object, and this sprites object contains URLs to various images here. So this is exactly where it's coming from. And what I'm doing is I'm grabbing the front default one. Okay, that's what I'm doing, because that's essentially going to be the this one right here is what I'm grabbing, this key right here. All right, because that's essentially just going to be the image that we're going to render out. So let's go back here. I think that should work once I run the code after I've finished the form handling. So excuse me. So let's just move on here. All right, so with the height, I'm going to set that to 300 because I'm going to make this slightly larger than the other images on the page. So that way it gets a little bit more attention. And then the width, I'll make that proportionate to 300 pixels. This is in pixels, by the way. I'm not sure if I explained that. That's in pixels, not in ems or anything like that. That would be fairly too large if it were ems. And I'm going to set an alt attribute as well, and that's going to be Pokemon image. You can set anything you want. I'm just going to say Pokemon image just for some accessibility purposes there. All right, and then below that, what I'm going to do, let me just bring this back up here. I'll define it right below it. I'm going to create another div, open and close that, and this is going to have a class. And this div is essentially what I'm going to do here in this div is I'm actually going to just output the text. So I'm going to give it a margin left of 4, just to give it some space between the image and the text itself, the text areas. And then I'm going to say leading -8. Now what that does is it gives it letter spacing. So in Tailwind CSS, leading is letter spacing. And so a -8 is fairly, I think it's almost 1 pixel. If not, it is 1 pixel. All right, so not quite sure, but it looks pretty good. So I really don't care how many pixels. It just needs to look good. So let's give it an H2 element. And this H2 here will be, we want that to be the name of the Pokemon. So that's going to be in search result, right? Search result dot name, because we should have a name attribute on the search results. So if I go back to our API, I do a search for name. There's a few name attributes. So we see a name here, this, yeah, name's right here, Pikachu, okay? And again, as I pointed out earlier, it's not beautified. So that's why we would need to capitalize that letter. And if there were 2 words, it would be hyphenated here. So we'll need to beautify that, okay? So what we need to do, actually with that being said, is we need to beautify that, this output here, okay? So to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put my cursor here and I'm going to say beautify and open up a parentheses, remove the closing, and then come to the end of this line and put the closing parentheses right after name, but just before the curly brace. And now what that's going to do is it's going to pass in the name of Pikachu or whatever Pokemon we return from the API, and it's going to beautify it for the user, right? Now again, the font bangers font, or the bangers font in short, will be automatically uppercase. So what essentially we're doing is just removing any potential dashes in the name. All right, what's next? So what we want to do now is let's work with some of the paragraphs. So the first paragraph here we're going to say is type, and then the type will be again beautify. And how do we get the type? We get it from search result dot, and I believe it is types. Yes. So I'm just looking here on the side here, on the side windows. So search result dot types, and it's weird because it returns an array, and we only want to get the first index of types. So what we need to do is say search result dot types index of 0, and then we need a question mark, and the question mark is because this could potentially be null, this value, right? Or the object may not even exist. So we need to be able to protect against that in the event that there may be an error. All right, so we're also, now this types of 0 has another type attribute. That's the weird part of it. So I'm gonna actually make that nullable as well. And now we're gonna grab the name, okay? So that's basically going to output, the type, which is electric or grass or earth, whatever type of Pokemon it is. All right, so that gets that done. The next one here is we want to output the height. So we're going to say a paragraph of height. And for this, we don't need to beautify anything. We just need to say search result dot. And I believe that is, I'm trying to think if it's, let me just double check here. Yes, search result height dot height. All right. And again, if you want to see exactly what I'm looking at here, let's go back and let's do a search here. Let's look at types again. And in this JSON, yep, we have the types right here that you see highlighted. And within that, we have this type object right here. And then we're outputting the name. So that was for the types. And then, right here, Pikachu is an electric type. So that's the reason why I'm showing that. And then for height, it's going to return an integer or a number. Where's height? Ooh, I think I clicked something else. Let's go back. All right. Height. There we go. So that's the height. Now, the heights are weird in this data, guys, because it's showing a height of 4. I don't think that means 4 feet, because that would be a very large Pokemon. What I did, whether it's right or wrong, it just looked more correct, is in most cases, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to multiply the height by 10, because I think it represents centimeters, but I think you have to multiply it by 10 to give it a more accurate result. So let's just go ahead and multiply that height by 10. Where's the what's going on here? Yeah, multiply it by 10. So we'll just need the asterisk or the star key and then 10, right? And that should, so in the case of 4, it's going to display 40 centimeters, for example, for height. So we're just going to add the unit right behind it. So we're going to say behind this curly brace, cm for centimeters. And that should take care of height. Now let's move on to weight. So weight, and let's see, the weight should be search result dot weight. I don't think we have to multiply anything there. I think it's pretty accurate. It's just going to be in kilograms, like that. Okay. All right. So now the next will be the abilities. All right. So for the abilities, I'm going to just render this as a list, an unordered list. It won't have any styling to the list, but I'm just going to render it that way, so that way things will display vertically. You can do this multiple ways if you wanted to do it, style it differently. I'm just doing it this way for the brevity of this, because this crash course is getting a bit long, so I'm going to just do it like this. So we're going to say search result, because that's where it's going to be, and then we're going to say dot abilities, because that's an array, I believe. Search result dot abilities, and what we want to do is we want to loop through this array. So we're going to use the map function of JavaScript to do that. And then we're going to just pass in here the item, which will be the actual object, and then the index, which will be a counter variable, so that way we can add a key on the element itself. And now this is going to be our arrow function, and we're going to opening, closing parentheses on that. And now we're just going to add an li element, because this is an unordered list, and we're going to give that a key. And this is mandatory, guys. Make sure you add a key whenever you're using a map function within your JSX. Make sure you add a key within it, so that way you don't get any error messages. And we're going to get in a key of index, which is the counter variable. And within this key, we're going to pass in the item dot the ability, which is an attribute within the abilities array object. So we're going to have an ability, and it's nullable because it could potentially return a null, or it could be undefined. And then we're going to just grab the name attribute there. All right. So for the most part, everything that I'm referencing, I'm just going to kind of flip back and forth between screens so you guys can see where I'm getting it from. So in the case of abilities, I scroll to the top here, you see that up here, there's this abilities array right here. And within each abilities array, we have an object called ability. And this ability will contain a name. In this case, static, like the static shock that Pikachu does. That's how Pikachu defeats his or her foes. So yeah, this array contains multiple ability objects, and we're just grabbing the name. So that's where that's coming from. All right. Guys, if that didn't make any sense, just kind of rewind this part of the video until it does. That's the best way to learn if you're new to this kind of stuff. All right. All right, so I think that would complete that part of the code. So now what we want to do is we want to work with it, the response, if it is a string. Now, the only time that this particular API should return a string response is if there's an error message. It returns a not found. So let me show you an example. Let me flip back to the browser. And as you can see, we were passing Pikachu, which was a valid Pokemon. But let's say, for example, if I were to pass, I don't know, let's say bees, like that, and I hit enter, it returns a not found string. So it's not even returning an array or JSON, it's just returning this string. So we need to be able to handle this special case. So let's go back to our VS Code here. And in here, what we're gonna do in this part is we're just gonna render out the like a special message here. And within the JavaScript itself, we're gonna handle the error message. Okay, so let's just bring this up here like that, and I'm gonna convert this into a p tag. And in this p tag, we're gonna give it the search result, just search result, that simple. But I'm gonna add some styling to this within line, and it's gonna be text center, so we could just center this within the output pane. So that should do it for the JSX, I believe. Cool, yeah, I think that should do it for the JSX. Let's go back up to our handler. All right, yes, right here. Okay, so within our handler, what we wanna do next is we want to take care of a few preliminary actions. So imagine a circumstance where we've already submitted the form and we've already stored a result in the state. And then let's say we want to do another search, a second search, a third search, a fourth search, and so on. Well, we could do that by just getting rid of the keyword within the input field and just doing another search. But what we should do to keep things nice and simple is we should reset the state back to null to avoid any potential collisions that could occur. Because what could happen is if your form doesn't properly handle the form submission, it'll just render out the same prior result that was rendered before you submitted the request. So let's go ahead and reset, for example, the search result state back to null, so that way the form will automatically wipe out the prior output. So we're going to set that back to null. And this is just kind of like a little bit of housekeeping we'll do before we'll submit the API request. The second thing we'll do here is we're going to set our loading to true so that we can display our spinner. Because remember, this method is getting called as soon as we click to submit the button. Speaking of which, now that I thought about that, let me just kind of go back down here. I just want to make sure I created that button with a type submit on it. So let me just go back down here. Where's that form? Yeah, so button, yeah, so we forgot to put the type submit on the button, guys. So make sure you go back to your button in your form and you just type in here, type is equal to submit, because this is exactly how Next.js knows that this is a form submission event. Okay, without that, it's not going to work. So make sure you just add the type submit to the button. All right, and now back to our on submit above. So now what we want to do in our on submit above is we want to make our API call. So I set this loading to true. So now that's going to display the loader at the very start of our form submission event. Now, what we want to do is make the API call. Now we get to the nitty gritty. So when we call the API, we could potentially see an error message if something goes wrong. So to handle that gracefully, we need to put a try catch block here. So we're going to say try, and then we're going to come down to the ending bracket here, and we're going to use the catch keyword, and then we're going to say we're going to catch an error. So we're just going to say ERR or error object, and let's handle the special case of the error message first. So in the case of an error message, we want to display a particular message to the user. The error message that we would expect in most cases would be that we weren't able to find any matching query, right? And the reason why that gets returned as an error is because the makers or the developers of the API automatically output a 404 error message, or a 404 not found error message, if you will, whenever a query does not match the keyword that the user has provided. So what we need to do is handle that case accordingly. So we're going to use our setter, which is part of our state. We're going to say set search result, and within here we're going to just give it a string. Let's use some backticks because we're going to interpolate some dynamic values within this string. So we're going to say let's say we couldn't, if I can type, we couldn't find any results matching. And now what we want to do is we want to input here or add within this string the actual keyword that the user provided, but we want that to be encapsulated within double quotes. So what we need to do is escape the quotes by using, actually we don't need to escape anything. What we can just do is the double quotes like this because we're using backticks. So what I'm going to do here is use the double quotes, and then I'm going to use the $, and then the curly braces like that, and then I'm going to use the keyword state. So that's going to automatically inject the keyword state, so the input that the user provided as part of the form submission. All right, so that should do that, and we'll just add a dot there to end the sentence, and we're going to say try a different query, and that should do it for the output. Lastly, I'm just gonna, for our developer team, we're just gonna output an error message to the console. So we're gonna say console.error, and we're gonna pass in the error object like that. We could do error.message, but I'm gonna pass the entire error object so that the way the developer team can kind of dig in. Now, obviously, it may not be the most robust solution. Ideally, in a real-world application, you would have some sort of logging mechanism, like a database table or some sort of external system that would be able to monitor these error messages for you. But just to keep things nice and simple, we're just doing it this way. Because I know that there will be some developers who are watching this video and already nitpicking some of the approaches I'm taking here. But there are many ways to make this work. All right, now let's get down to the meat and potatoes, which is the try area. So the try area will be the actual part that we'll execute. So the very first thing here is we're going to make our API call. So we're going to say const response, and we're going to set that equal to await. We're going to use our JavaScript fetch function. Let's just close that out for now. Now we're going to use the backticks, and if you guys recall, we brought in that base URI variable that we defined in our helpers.js file. So we're going to use that right now. We're going to say base_URI. And we remember we took off the trailing slash, so we have to add it here. So we're going to say slash. And what we want to do is we want to call the Pokemon endpoints. We're going to type in here Pokemon. And we're going to add another slash. And then the next argument here will be the keyword that the user provided as part of the form submission. So it's in our state. So we're just going to add the keyword like that. Right? And we have our semicolon, so that part should be fine. And lastly here, we're going to say set search result. And in here, what we need to do is we need to await the response. Because again, this is an asynchronous callout, and that's the reason why we mark this as async up top. So we need to say await response.json. And that's going to await this response. And that should return the search result as JSON to the state and store it. All right? All right, I think this component might be done. Let's give things a test. So let's go back. We had it in this tab here. I'm just going to do a refresh just to make sure. Let's refresh our page. Okay, so let's test this. Let's start off with our friend Pikachu. So let's say Pikachu. And let's click go. And now you see the loader, you see the spinner, guys. All right, so now it's still spinning. So that's telling me one of two things. The fact that it's still spinning is either telling me that the API is taking a long time or there's a problem in our code. And I think it's the latter. So let's go back to Visual Studio Code. Let's see here. What are we missing? Okay, so we added the set loading, right? We've added the set loading here and we set that to true, but what we forgot to do is mark that as false at the very end. Because after this API code, whether there's an error or not, finishes executing, what we need to do is set that set loading back to false to get rid of the loader. So let's say set loading down here right before the closing brace, set loading, and we're going to pass in false, and that should get rid of this the spinner. So let's go back to our browser, let's refresh, and let's try it again. We're going to try Pikachu again, right? And we're going to click go. We have an error message. Let's see what we're seeing here. Let's see. Okay, I'm not sure why that's happening. It's hard to see that. Let's copy that. Not sure why that coloring is off. Let's go here. I'm just going to go down to the bottom, guys, and paste that in here. All right, so what do we have here? So invalid source. You know why? So remember, I said that in our Next.js project, whenever we're using the image element, we need to go to our next.config file and we need to edit that file so that way we can handle external images, right? If you guys remember, I mentioned that earlier. So let's just get rid of that. All right, so now let's go back up to where we have our image. I'm just going to do a Command F and I'm going to search for image, and it's right here. All right. Okay, and as you guys can see, we're actually passing in this search result, sprites, and then front default, and that's an external URL. So what we need to do to make this work to avoid these error messages is we need to open up our next.config.js file. So it's going to be next.config.js, and this is in our root directory of our project. So I'm just going to open that up. And this file is generally used to configure any Next.js specific configurations that you need to add to your project. So in this case, we're only going to add an images configuration. So that way we can use external images with our image, our next/image reference. So this next config object, we can go ahead and open that up like that because this is our object that we're going to define, and we're going to just use the images object, curly braces, and open it up like that. Oops, I'm not sure what happened there. Like that. Cool. Now this images object takes in a remote, I think it's remotePatterns. So remotePatterns, yep. And that remotePatterns is actually an array. So I'm just going to use the square brackets here and open that up. Now within this array, we'll have a list of objects. So we're going to add an object with the curly braces just like this. Make sure it's typed exactly like this, guys, to avoid any error messages. All right, so the first attribute here will be our protocol, and that's going to be just HTTPS as a string for the SSL protected protocol. And then the second thing we'll add here is our host name. And that host name is actually going to be the domain name where our images are hosted. So because we need to provide that access to Next.js. So that's going to be raw.github. I think it's raw GitHub user content.com. I'll just add a comma to the end. So raw GitHub user content.com. Now what we're going to do is we're going to check to see if that's correct. So let's go back to our browser here and let's go back to PokeAPI. Let's see. Let's just look up another Pokemon here. Actually, let's just look up Pikachu. All right. Now, where I got that from, if we go back to sprites, our sprites object here, you'll see that down here, this is the domain name right here, raw.githubusercontent.com. So it's hosted on GitHub's special file upload domain. And basically, we needed to add this domain to our Next.js project to allow us to use external images. All right, so I think that's fine. I'm just going to add a comma here as well so we know where this ends. And I'm also going to add a comma to the end of this array. You don't have to do that, guys. I just like to do it as proper convention so that way it's easy to read this in the future. All right, so I think that should do it. Now, whenever we edit our next.config.js file, it's good practice for us to stop our server and reload it. So to stop our server on a Mac, I believe it is Control-C, like that. On a Windows is something similar. It may be Alt-C. I can't remember. Just look it up. I'm just going to clear my output below, and I'm going to type again npm run dev to restart the server. All right, now let's flip to our browser, and I'm going to refresh this page. Okay. So now we have the form again. So now what we're going to do, let's go ahead and try this again and see what we get back. So again, in here, just not sure what's going on here. So we're going to type in Pikachu, and we're going to click go. Something happened here. What's going on? Pikachu. Okay, that's not working accordingly. Actually, yeah, it worked. Not sure. Oh, yes, because the reason why we saw that brief pause is because of the spinner. It was very quick. Look at this again. I'm going to click go. Okay, let's try a different Pokemon. Let's try Raichu, the evolved form. Raichu. Okay, now pay attention. Okay, that was very, very quick this time, guys. But in some cases, it could be slow. So we have Raichu. So now we're returning the information. There's just one problem. The font is not displaying correctly. So this Raichu font should be the font bangers font. Everything else looks good, though. Let's go ahead and fix that font first. So let's go back to Visual Studio Code. So this is working. I'm just going to close out a few of these here. Let me just close all and just reopen the search form. So search form. All right, so we need to fix that. And that was the name, right? I think that was the name. So let's just type .name to get to it. Okay. Yes, it was here. Yep, it is. And then the reason why is because we forgot to put the font bangers on it. So font bangers right here like that. And now if I go back, now we see it's the correct font, Raichu. Yeah, this is looking awesome. All right, so now let's just test one more thing with this form. What happens if we give it a bad Pokemon name, right? Because that can happen. So let's go back here and let's just type in Mousy. All right, and I'm just gonna hit enter. So now we see the spinner, and now it's giving us the error message. Wonderful. So we couldn't find a user or rather a Pokemon by that name, Mousy. Yep. So this is working perfectly. So guys, we're pretty much halfway there now. So it's looking great. All right. So now let's move on. So now that search form is done, and actually there's one more thing I want to test now that I think about it. We put the required attribute on this form as well, right? So let's just remove that. And with no input, I completely remove the Mousy input. If I just click go, as you can see, the browser by default gives us this, please fill out this, this input field. So I can't even submit this form unless I fill this out. But again, in a real world scenario, not only would you have this required attribute on this input, you would also have form validation logic that would output errors depending on whatever the circumstance is. All right. So, all right, we're good to go here. I think we can close that all up. And the next thing we're going to work on here will be the TopPokemon. So I'm just going to do Command P. I'm going to type TopPokemon. All right. So this component now will be responsible for rendering out some 10 random Pokemon in a table. That's essentially what it's going to do. Now, going back to our browser, if you recall, basically when we submit this form, we're getting back data asynchronously, but it's more dynamic because it's happening after page load, and it's based on and dependent on a specific event occurring. In this case, it's depending on the form event. But what we want to do now is we want to be able to render data immediately upon page load without having to do anything else. So we need to use a server component instead of a client component this time. So now this top Pokemon component will be a server component. Now the good thing about this is we don't have to come up top and say use server. It automatically happens by default. All we need to do is define our code in here and then write our API code, and immediately it would render it as a server component. In prior versions of Next.js, Next.js 12 and under, we used to have to use the get server-side props and the get static props functions to render code on the server side via the SSR or server-side rendering mechanism. We no longer have to do that in Next.js 13 and 14. All right, so the very first thing I'm going to do to demonstrate this is I'm going to get rid of this first line up here. Now I'm going to bring in a couple of imports. We're going to import first the base URI, of course, semicolon. Next, we're going to input the image because, again, we want to display images to the user. Let's see, what else do we want? Let's bring in the beautify. And I could just do import beautify on a separate line, but no, I want to be as concise as possible here, and I'm just going to put it up here because it's coming from the same file anyway. So I might as well just input it or import it in one line. All right, I think that's all we need for imports. If anything, we can come back if we need something else. So let's fix our indentations here. I'm not sure why these indentations are not working out the box. Sometimes it's indents improperly. I think this one is okay. There's definitely some inconsistencies in Visual Studio Code when it comes to working with React and Next.js. So if you have any suggestions on how to fix the indentation, put it in the comments below. And by the way, at this stage, guys, we're 50% done with this course. Please like this video and subscribe if you haven't done so yet. It really helps me to continue making videos like this. We're also going to be bringing in other people to help build some video content for you guys. So please make sure you like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon to stay notified. Make sure you share this with the entire world because this really helps us to kind of get our voice out there and help folks learn more about the wonderful world of computer programming. All right, so continuing after that brief PSA, what we want to do is essentially we want to build this server-side component. And the first thing we're going to do, let's take this out here. Let's add a simple React fragment here like that. What we want to do in a server-side component, a typical convention is we define functions that are responsible for loading data or writing data to a database, calling an API. We define that up top above the component itself, instead of having to use the get server-side props in prior versions of Next.js, as I mentioned earlier. So the first thing we're going to do, let me just put some comments here. I'm going to say server component API calls. Okay. We're going to make two calls because the first call will be to grab a list of random Pokemon, 10 random Pokemon. And then the second call will be to make a call, an API call to each and every URI that's returned as part of the first request. I'll show you what I mean in a second. Actually, you know what? Let me do this. Let's go to our browser here. I'm going to show you guys what I mean. Where is that? Okay. Let's go back here. So we have this endpoint. Let's remove Pikachu. So we're essentially just going to be making a get call to this endpoint here, /Pokemon. If I hit enter, now you guys can see I'm getting back a list of Pokemon. There are 1,292 Pokemon total, quite a bit. And this list only returns the name of the Pokemon and the URI of each Pokemon, the URL rather. Now the URL is essentially an endpoint. These URLs or these endpoints can accept one of two types of arguments. Either you can pass to the Pokemon endpoint the ID of the record, which could, in this case would be 1, 2, 3, and so on, as you see here. Or you can pass the name of the Pokemon as we have been doing, which is like Pikachu, Raichu, and so on. What I'm going to be doing is in this first API call, I'm going to make a call to this endpoint to grab all of this JSON, or essentially the first 10 JSONs, or let's just say random 10 JSONs, because I'm going to grab random Pokemon every single time I make this call. And then I'm going to take the URL property values here, and then I'm going to make subsequent API calls to grab each and every one. Now, in a real world scenario, again, it may not be the most optimized way of doing it. For my senior developers watching this video right now, generally, you probably would agree, you would have a separate API endpoint that would pretty much combine this data into one endpoint. So you would have like an endpoint that would have some of this Pokemon data, and then you would probably return the data back in chunks, and then have like the attributes, the inner objects or the nested objects within each object. You know, we're doing things a little bit more complicated, but yet it's still easier to understand. And you'll see what I mean in a second. So yeah, so let's make this first API call. So let's go back to our Visual Studio Code. I guess first what we'll do here, let's see, what are we going to do? You know what? Let's go ahead and let's build our JSX first before we write the API code. I want to build the JSX first. All right. I'm just thinking here. Yeah, let's build our JSX first. So let's go back down here, and within our brackets, let's just give it an H1, and I believe that class name was font bangers that we added here. and here we want to give that a text. Let's center the text. All right, text center. And that's a utility class. That's not a custom class. It's a Tailwind CSS class. That's going to be top Pokemon. Okay, so that's what that is here. You know what? Now, what we're going to do is we're not going to be able to finish the rest of this because it's going to be dependent upon the values of our code. So what I'm going to do instead is let me go back up here and let's work on some of the API code. At least we got the heading out the way. So up here, what I want to do is call that first API endpoint to grab the name and URL for 10 random Pokemon. So first we're going to say async, because it's going to be an async function. So async function, because we want that to fire off asynchronously. The first one's going to be called fetch Pokemon. Fetch Pokemon, let's call it fetch Pokemon list. So this is just going to fetch that list that we saw, the list of JSON objects that we saw. So we're going to say const total Pokemon count. Now the count was in the API, but because we need, so what we want to do is we want to store the count here. We're just going to hard code it as 1292, and again that's coming from the API up here, this count. The reason why we're going to hard code this is because we just want to be able to grab a random set of 10 Pokemon, and we don't want to surpass the 1292nd Pokemon, right? So we only want to limit it between the first Pokemon and the 1292nd Pokemon, right? So that's why we're just going to hard code that here. Obviously, in a real world, you probably would just figure out a different way to store this in a database, but we're just going to do that for argument's sake here. All right. Next, what we're going to do here is we're going to define an offset, because this API endpoint can take an offset query string. And that's going to be, this is where we're going to have our randomized logic. So we're going to say math.floor. And just follow along for now, guys. It's going to be quite a bit, and I can explain everything shortly. So in our math.floor, we're going to pass in math.random. And we're going to multiply that. Let's multiply that by the total Pokemon count, because that's going to give us the upper bound of our randomness, and then we're going to just add 1 to it because we want to exclude the next the next position, which is 1293. We want to be able to just do +1 to grab a random. It's based on between 0 and 1, the randomness factor. So the offset there, based on the fact that we're multiplying that by 1292, that's going to get us a random number that we can use to then grab the 10 that we want based on where we want to start. So for example, what this line does is, let's say for example, if math.random returned 0.5, for example, then we're going to multiply that by the 1292, and then we're going to add 1, and that's going to be our offset. So it'll be like 600 something, about 640 something, for example. Hopefully that made sense what I'm saying. You'll see once I get to it. So now the next thing we're going to do is we're going to say const limit, because what we want to do is only return 10 results. So we're going to just set that to a number of 10, or an integer of 10. All right, now we're going to make the API call so we can have a potential error. So to handle that gracefully, we're going to use a try catch. So we're going to say try catch, similarly to what we've done before, and then we have our error object. And so let's take care of our error first. Now in this case, I mean, we're not working with any state because this is a server component. So what we're just going to do is we're just going to say console.error, and we're just going to output the error for the development team to, triage any errors that can occur. All right. Next, we're going to define our response, const response, and that's going to be await fetch again. And let's just open this up like this. So now what we want to fetch for this first API call is we want to be able to call the Pokemon endpoint, and we want to pass in also a query string. So let's use some backticks to do that, and a $, and we're going to pass in that base URI / and that's going to go to Pokemon. And now to define the query strings, we need to pass a question mark here. And the first one that is allowed is offset. And this is part of the API documentation, guys. The PokeAPI documentation. I'll leave the website for you guys to review. So offset, that offset is going to be equal to the offset that we grab. So it could be any number between 1 to 1292. Okay. Cool. Offset. And now we need an and symbol, or an ampersand, because we need to concatenate to the end of that the limit. And the limit is going to be just limit like this. Now, you may be asking yourself, well, what would happen if the number is 1,000, let's say 1,291, 1,292? Even though you're passing a limit, would there be an error message? It depends on the API. In this API, I don't think there would be an error message. In fact, what we can do, let's check that. Let's play around with this a little bit. So we have this endpoint. If I do a question mark, what happened here? If I do a question mark and I say offset is equal to 1292, and then and limit is equal to 10, and hit enter, it's just only going to give me that very last record. So there should be no error message in this case. So I think we should be fine. All right. And so we don't need to handle that special scenario. The API does that for us. All right. One less thing to worry about. All right. Cool. So let's continue here. Now, what we want to do is we're going to open up a set of curly braces to define an object here as a second parameter. So we're going to do comma and then an object here. And in this object, Next.js allows us to pass a property called next. Because what we want to essentially do is, because this content is getting server-side rendered, it's not being rendered with a client component. That means it's essentially going to load on page load. What we want to do is we don't necessarily always want to hit the API every single time the page loads. We may just want to keep things up to date on an interval basis. So in this case, Next.js provides this next object in which we can define special cases or special properties for loading the page, for example. So for example, this next is an object, curly braces, open it up, and there is a property called revalidate. And this revalidate property takes in a number based on seconds. So I'm going to give this 60 seconds like that. And I'm just going to add a comma to there and a comma to the end of that. Right? Again, the commas are not necessary. It's just my preference. Now, what does this revalidate do? Basically, what this is saying is that every 60 seconds, refresh the page. Essentially, get rid of the cached version of whatever you have and do a completely fresh refresh, for lack of a better term. So that's why we have to revalidate the content every 60 seconds. And if there is new content, if there have been any updates, pull in those updates from the API. In the case of a database call, it would do the same thing. And in the case of a database, it would cache the data for up to 60 seconds. And then on the 60th second, it would then go out on the next request and get the freshest data from the database. Yeah, so this is a great way to lessen the server load at the same time keeping your data up to date. All right, so that's what that is. And we're going to be doing that for the other server-side call that we'll do shortly as well. All right, so hopefully that made sense. If it's still not clear, just kind of look at some documentation. It'll do a much better job of explaining than I would. All right, all right, so the only thing we have to do now is we just need to return this value. So down here below the catch, this is going to return back JSON because this is a method. This is an API call. So we're going to say return, because we want to return this to whatever method called this. So we're going to say return, and this is going to say return await, because again, this is an asynchronous call, and we're going to await the response to that JSON like we did in the other file. All right. And that is now saved. So that's going to be the first method call to get the list that we saw earlier. All right, so now we need to do one more API call that's similar to this, but I'm going to type it from scratch. I'm not going to copy it, so that way, you got the more you type, the more you learn. So just follow along. The next call is going to be, again, if I go back to this API, we have this, we have a URI. Let me get rid of this. Actually, let me see if I do, let's get rid of this here. So we should just have /Pokemon here. As you can see, we have this URL attribute, okay? URL. So what we need to do is we need to make an API call using that URI, or the entire URL. So let's go back to our code here. I'm gonna define another async callout. So async function. Let's call this fetch Pokemon data. Async function fetch Pokemon data. Now this is going to take in a parameter of the Pokemon list that we fetched in a prior call. Right? We want to pass the entire list because it's going to contain the 10 objects that we need to use to query the API. Right? And now, so what we're going to do here is because we're doing multiple callouts, there will be multiple responses coming back. Now, instead of just simply using a basic for loop or a map or something like that and just handling every single request separately, that's more inefficient. What we're going to use is we're going to use promise.all to handle all of the responses asynchronously. So let's do that. So we're going to say const, and this is going to return a promise. And what a promise is for the newbies here, a promise is essentially a promise to return a response from the API outbound call, the call out. Okay, so essentially JavaScript is promising to get a response, whether an error message or a valid message from the API, no matter what it is. So we need to be able to handle those promises on the fly in an asynchronous fashion. All right, so that's what that means. So promise, and then we're going to use our Pokemon list because we're going to loop through that list, right? We have to loop through each and every object and grab the URL attribute from each object. So we're going to say Pokemon list.map. And in here, we're going to do something slightly different. We're going to say async Pokemon. And then we're going to do an arrow function. And instead of using the parentheses like we normally do in the HTML, because this is just pure JavaScript, we have to use the curly braces here. Hit enter and then close this out with a semicolon. Okay? So now the reason why we're saying async here is because we need to be able to handle the callback function asynchronously within this map function call. So first we're going to say const response, and we're going to set that equal to await fetch new line semicolon at the end, and the URL that we want is going to be in this Pokemon object. So it's going to say Pokemon.url, and that's coming from that JSON that we saw here, right? Because each object will be in the Pokemon variable, and then we're saying Pokemon.url to grab the URL. So that's going to be our endpoint right here. So then on the next line, we're going to have our object like we did before, and we're going to have our next object, and then we're going to set our revalidate again to 60 seconds. And then our question marks, or sorry, our commas like that. Okay. And now lastly, we're going to do like we did above. We're going to return the value of the awaited function call and response.json like that. Oops. All right. All right. Pretty complicated stuff for newbies. After a couple of years of doing this, you kind of get used to it. I'm pretty much going at a slow slow pace with tongue-tied there. A slow pace, so that way you guys know exactly how this works. All right. Cool. I think that should be it for that. I'm just trying to think if there's anything else we need to cover here. Nope, that should be it for that. I think we can move on to our actual elements here. So the last part of this, folks, and we're almost at the finish line here, the last part of this is for us to do our outputting. So the very first thing is we're going to open up a set of curly braces in our JSX, and what we need to do is check to see if Pokemon exists. So if it is not undefined and if it is not null, we're just going to use a question mark here because this is kind of like if Pokemon. So we're going to say if Pokemon has a value, essentially. I'm just going to set this like this for now and just put some brackets like that. So I'm not sure what happened there. Yep, okay, fine. All right, so if it has a value, what we want to do in here is we want to output a table. So we've already added the styling to our CSS file, our globals.css. So we're going to have our table here. And then we're going to have here a table row. We're going to open that up. And this table row would have a class, and that's going to be font bangers because we're going to give it that special font. And in this table row, the first table row will have a table heading with no text between because we don't want to display any text in that cell. The next cell, the next table heading cell, or th tag, will have a name, and then the final one of th will be abilities. Right. Abilities. Okay. I'm going to save that. Command S. Okay. Now that I think about it, the one thing I want to do is let's make an adjustment here. This is not necessary, but I like to do this for semantic clarity. So in here within this table tag, I'm going to add a tag called thead. All right. And then I'm just going to take the code that we just wrote, the entire table row code, and I'm just going to cut that out like that. Bring that up, and I'm going to paste this here and then indent properly like that. Now, that's just kind of like specifying that this is the table header or the table heading. All right. So I don't think it's now. I'm not sure if I have styling on this. Let me just double check. So go to global CSS. Yeah, we do have styling on this, so I would definitely add that in if you've missed it, okay? Let's go back to TopPokemon. All right, so now we've added a T head, so now let's add a T body for the table body. And in here, I know this one definitely has styling. In here, what we need to do is we need to map or loop through all of the entries that's getting returned from the API, all of the 10 objects. So what we'll do is we're going to reference that Pokemon value or variable, but we're going to use a question mark because it could be that it's null. Now, normally I wouldn't have to do this. Actually, I don't think I need to do this in this case because we're checking it above. So yeah, we don't need that. So we're just going to do .map. It doesn't hurt anything if you do add that question mark, but I'm just going to take it out because we have it above. And what we're going to do is we're going to pass in the item and the index counter. And this is going to be an arrow function. And instead of the curly braces, we're going to use parentheses because this is within HTML. We're going to hit enter. Okay. Now, if you guys recall, because we have a map function, we're just going to add a table row here and we're going to add a key. And the key needs to be index. Please do that because it's very important. That's how Next.js is able to index, excuse me, appropriately. Actually, you know what? I don't think we need an index here, do we? Let me think about this. I don't think we could just use the ID property. But you know what? Let's use index. We could use item.id also for that. But I'm just going to use the index only because it's, you know, we already have a counter for it, so we might as well just use it. You can use either or. But definitely on this table row, we're going to have a few more attributes here. So we have a key. We're going to add a class name. Now the class name attribute, we're going to need some curly braces here because what we want to do is we're going to give it this striped row effect that we saw in the demo, where one row is kind of like just a white background. The other one is sort of like an amberish or a light yellow background. So let's say index. And we're going to use a modulus to basically say that if the index number is an even number, like 0, 2, 4, 6, 8, and so on, then we need to output the white background. Otherwise, if it's an odd number, we need to output the gray. It's actually a gray background. I said amber, but it's gray. So we're going to say index modulus, which will be a percentage sign of 2, if index percentage sign 2 is equal to 3 0. Yep, if it's equal to 0, question mark. And now what we're going to do is just output BG white. And then after that, we're going to use a colon. Else, we're going to output BG dash gray. And let's give it a gray color of 300, a very light gray. Right, so that's going to give it a stripe effect on each row, alternating stripe effect. All right, so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to have a table cell. Let's open that up. And in this cell, the very first thing we're going to have is the image. So we're going to bring in the image. And I think we imported that above already, so we're good to go there. Now, we don't have to edit our config file anymore because, you know, we're referencing the correct domain where the image is stored. So all we need to do is say source. And the source is going to be item.sprites. And we're going to use our question mark because that could be nullable. And then that's going to be the front underscore default. Right? So that's going to be kind of like the same property that we referenced before in the other component. Okay, and then now we have here the height. The height will be 250. Okay, and then the width will also be 250 to make it proportionate. And then let's add an alt. Now with this alt, I can actually use a dynamic value. So we're going to just say item.name here to give it some alt text. Okay. And I think that should do it for that. We don't need a priority in this case because this is below the fold of the page. And we've already given a priority to the logo anyway, so we don't need it here. All right, so all right, so that's the first cell. The second cell is add another TD. The second cell here, actually, let's just bring this on one line. The second cell here is going to be the name of the Pokemon. So we're going to just say item.name. That's simple. But what we need to do now that I think about it is, because that name is going to, it can return back hyphenated, right? So what we're going to, and I'll show you this right now. So as you can see here, we're looking at like these names, Bulbasaur, Venusaur, and so on. And some of these names could be hyphenated, and they're definitely lowercased. So I want to make them uppercase, like capitalize the name, and then I want to split on the hyphen. So let's go back here, and all we need to do that is we need to just pass in our pass this value into our beautify method. So right here we're going to just say beautify and pass that in like that with parentheses. All right. Oops, actually, it's on the wrong element. Should not be there. It's just Control Z. It should be down here. All right, so beautify on this right here. It's getting late, guys, so. All right, so yeah, we're beautifying this name here, okay? All right. And then the final cell, just make some space here. In this final cell, what we want to do is we want to output an unordered list again, like we did above. So let's just do UL. Now, we could have just made a component out of this. So in a real world scenario, you probably would have a component that's responsible for outputting abilities, like an abilities component. But for the sake of this video, which is already way too long, I'm just going to do it like this. So don't hate me if I'm doing it this way for the experienced ones out here. All right, so let's just say item. For this, we're going to say item.abilities again. Abilities, oops. And that's nullable, .map. And for this, what we're going to do is we're going to have an ABL, let's call it ABL object, and then an index. Yeah, and then this is going to be an arrow function with parentheses like that. All right, so now within this, we're going to have an li. This li is going to have a key, and that's going to be the index. And in here, what we're going to do is we're going to say ABL.ability, because remember, this abilities array has an ability property in each object. So we need to say .ability, and then we're going to say question mark .name. Not sure what happened there. ABL.ability question mark .name. Okay. Okay, let's see if this is okay. And actually, we want to beautify that as well, right? Because this can also be raw. So let's just say beautify, and just pass that in. Just put the parentheses. Make sure that when you're closing these parentheses is right before the curly brace. Okay. All right. I think that might be it. All right. Let's give that a shot. Let's see what we get back. So if I go back to our browser here, we have an error message, Pokemon. Oh, that's because I don't think we defined a state yet, did we? Okay, let's see here. Yeah, so what we forgot to do here is, let's go back to our component. So we've already defined our API calls, so our server component API calls. What we need to do is within the actual page component, or the component, the React component, we need to now handle the, we need to now call these methods, right? So let's go down here. All right, so yeah, we haven't done that. So this is the TopPokemon component. So this is the main component of this file. All right, so don't confuse that with these functions above. All right, so this just makes some space here, because up here what we need to do is we need to call these methods, so that way we're able to actually fetch the data. Okay, so let me see how I want to do this. What I want to do first is I want to call the first endpoint. So we're going to say const, And what we're going to be expecting back is a results array, I believe. So it's going to be equal to await, and we're going to await fetch Pokemon list. That's the very first one that we defined above. Now, because I'm using await here, you see that this is giving me an error message. And the reason why it's giving me an error message is because I need to define this component as an async component. So let's do that up here. Right next to TopPokemon equals, we're just going to add the async keyword. And that should get rid of that error message. Now this becomes an asynchronous component. All right, so the next thing we're going to do here is we're going to say const, and we're going to return the actual Pokemon. So let's say Pokemon as in plural, Pokemon, not a single one. Pokemon is equal to await fetch Pokemon data. So we're going to fetch the data, and what we're going to do is pass in the results. Yeah, because remember, we need to pass in a Pokemon list so that way we know which URL to call. And I think that should be it now. So if I save that, all right, we got our awaits here. Cool. So if I go back, let's refresh. We still have an error message here. Return wait response .json. So it's not like in our return statement. What line is that? That's line number 24. So this now, welcome to our troubleshooting part of the course. All right, so it's not liking the return await response .json. What does this error message say here? Now, sometimes we can see the output down here below, and we could right here if you guys can see that. So basically it's not liking it because, let's scroll up here. Where does this begin? Okay, reference error. Response is not defined. So it's not finding the response variable. So back at line number 24, that's because it probably doesn't see the response, right? Okay. Yes, that's because this needs to be within the same block of code. So let's get rid of that here. Down here, I want to just return null, because if we don't have anything back from the API, let's just return null here. And up here, right above the catch, is where I want to return this response, right? Because response is where? It's right here. So that should work by me returning null like this. There we go. All right, so we have another error message, line 41. So this is the other method. So the same problem. Const response. Yes, I think it's the same problem, right? Okay. It's not getting back the response. I'm not sure why. Okay, const response. Just want to make sure that's spelled correctly. Yeah, it should be working. Let's see, what is that? Let me just clear out my console here. Let's go back. I'm just going to refresh again so I can get new output here. Okay, so this is reference error response is not defined. Huh. Response is not defined. Const response. This belongs to this here. So, oh, it's because I'm not handling the promises yet. So that's the part that we're missing, guys. So what we need to do here is, we need to handle, and I mentioned it earlier, but I totally forgot to do that part. So what we need to do here is we need to handle the promises. All right, so first things first, this response JSON should belong in here, right? Because what we need to do is get access to it. Because if you look at this here, this is what confused me here. On line number 30, we have our const promises, and then we're making this call here, right? So what we need to do is we need to put this line here within this block of code, within the response, because we want to return this response as part of our promises. And then outside of that, right before the end of this call, let's just bring this up and make a line. We're going to say here, return await, and we're going to do promise dot all promises. Okay. So just to kind of reiterate what this is. So on line number 30, we're making a call out and we're looping through the list of Pokemon that we got returned from the call, the first call, which had the name and URL attributes in each object. We're looping through each object, and within each object, we're now doing an API call out using the URL as our endpoint. And then what that's going to do is it's going to return a response from that particular endpoint, and we're going to return that response JSON back to our promises variable. So once we map through this, it's going to return an array of promises, essentially, an array of promises. And within the array of promises, then at the very bottom, before we exit the method, we return the promises.all, and we pass in the array of promises, so that way we're able to process all of the responses coming back, the promises coming back. So this should work. Now, if I go back, now you guys can see, I'm not sure what happened there. Let's do a refresh. Now you guys can see the Pokemon. All right, perfect. So now we see the Pokemon images, and this is server-side rendered. Okay, so this is getting rendered as part of our server component. I didn't have to do anything. So again, if I refresh, so if you guys can see the images, I want to see you guys to see how the images will change when I refresh. So if I refresh here, I'm not sure what happened there. Let's do another refresh. Now we see completely different Pokemon. Okay, and if I refresh again, I just want to make sure this is not buggy. Let's refresh again. We have our loader that shows, and we have another set of Pokemon. We have another 10 Pokemon here, right? And you can see that the names are beautified, and so are the skill lists. They're also beautified. So, I mean, that's pretty much done, guys. Now, obviously, you should definitely think about what you can do to make this application even better than what it already is. What I would do is normally, as a next step, I would add like some sort of additional error handling to this table to output some sort of error messages here on the server side, rendered side, server component side rather. Probably would have some sort of logging table in the database to capture these error messages, so that way we can triage every single error as they happen. But since this is a very small application, there really isn't a need to go that far. This is just some ideas that you guys can implement. So one thing I would suggest is that you guys just kind of play around, add more features to this. Maybe, you know, add as an example a list of moves that every single Pokemon can do. Maybe you add some sort of gamification like point values to certain attributes and things like that. So this is a multitude of things that you can do to make this application a lot better. And, you know, with that being said, guys, that pretty much completes and concludes this tutorial on how to use Next.js 14 to build a Pokemon Profiler app. You know, I want to thank you guys for supporting this channel. It's definitely growing again. Please smash that like button, subscribe, hit the bell icon for future videos. I'm definitely coming back with another banger soon. Take care, guys. Happy coding. Stay tuned for more.